The afternoon light filtered through the half-drawn curtains of James Sullivan's study in Arlington, Virginia. The warm glow caught the edge of a silver frame on his oak desk, drawing attention to the weathered black and white photograph inside. It showed 5 men standing proudly beside a tank destroyer, its long 90mm gun pointing skyward like an accusatory finger. The year was 1973, nearly 3 decades since the photograph had been taken, but the memories remained as vivid as yesterday. Lieutenant Colonel James "Iron Jim" Sullivan, retired, ran his calloused fingers along the frame's edge. At 65, his once commanding posture had softened, but his eyes retained the piercing focus that had earned him his nickname. The photograph transported him to another time, another world. He could almost smell the diesel fuel and cordite, hear the mechanical growl of the engine, feel the cold metal of the hatch under his hands. The doorbell's chime pulled Sullivan from his reverie. He made his way through his modest home, decorated with subtle reminders of his military service. On the mantelpiece sat his Bronze Star and Distinguished Service Cross, not prominently displayed, but present nonetheless. Sullivan wasn't the type to boast. The results spoke for themselves. Opening the door, his weathered face broke into a genuine smile. "David," he said, embracing his 22-year-old grandson with surprising strength. Right on time, military punctuality must run in the blood. David Sullivan, tall and lean with his grandfather's jawline, returned the embrace. "Good to see you, Grandpa." Under his arm, he carried a package wrapped in brown paper. In the living room, David carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a detailed scale model. "Just came out," he said with evident pride. "The new M1 Abrams tank. My engineering professor helped me get the proportions exactly right." The older Sullivan leaned forward in his armchair, his interest piqued. His eyes moved across the model with professional assessment. "Beautiful work," he said finally, genuine appreciation in his voice. "The composite armor design is something else. And look at the stabilization system for the main gun." His finger traced the turret. "You know, in my day, we'd have killed for this kind of technological advantage." David placed the model on the coffee table between them. "That's actually why I wanted to show you. We're studying armor development in my advanced engineering class. Everyone's focusing on the modern stuff, but I'm more interested in how we got here." He paused. "I know you served with tank destroyers in the war, but you've never really talked about it." Sullivan's eyes drifted to the window. Outside, the maple trees were beginning to turn gold and red with autumn's approach. Finally, he spoke. "Come with me." In his study, Sullivan pointed to the photograph on his desk. "That's the M36 tank destroyer. The men called it Vengeance, and those men were my crew." David studied the image with newfound interest. "Is that you?" he asked, pointing to a tall officer standing in the middle. Sullivan nodded. 30 years younger and 100 years less wise. "Why the M36?" David asked. "What made it special? It doesn't look that impressive compared to German tanks from the same period." Sullivan settled back into his leather chair, a faint smile playing across his lips. "That's exactly the point. It wasn't impressive on paper. It wasn't meant to be." His voice took on a storyteller's cadence. "Let me tell you about a time when we had to find solutions fast, or lose everything. When American ingenuity had to overcome German engineering superiority. When a stopgap became a big cat killer." The old clock on the mantel ticked steadily as Sullivan began his tale, transporting them both back to the blood-soaked fields of Europe in 1904. Chapter 2. Fateful Day in Normandy. The ground trembled beneath his boots. Captain James Sullivan pressed his back against the shattered remains of a stone wall as another shell screamed overhead. July 1944. Normandy was supposed to be secured by now. The beachheads were firmly in Allied hands, and the push inland was gaining momentum. But here, in this small French village, whose name he could barely pronounce, momentum had stalled against German armor. "Range estimate 1,400 yards, sir," shouted Lieutenant Parker, his voice barely audible above the din of battle. Sullivan raised his field glasses, scanning the tree line where dark shapes moved between pillars of smoke. The unmistakable silhouette of a Panther tank emerged, its long 75mm guns searching for targets. Behind it, the even more massive form of a Tiger lurked, its 80mm cannon a harbinger of death. "Tell Able and Baker companies to hold position," Sullivan ordered his radio man. "Charlie Company, prepare to provide covering fire." Before the order could be relayed, a brilliant flash erupted from the Panther's gun. Seconds later, one of Sullivan's Sherman tanks erupted in flames, its turret blown completely off. Men scrambled from the burning hull, their uniforms alight. Some made it, others didn't. Sullivan felt a familiar mixture of rage and helplessness. His M4 Shermans, workhorses of the American armored divisions, were outclassed. Their 75mm guns could barely penetrate the Panthers' frontal armor at this range, while the German tanks could punch through a Sherman at twice the distance. "Pull back to the ridgeline," Sullivan ordered. "We'll set up a defense there." As the remaining tanks began their withdrawal, the German armor pressed forward, sensing weakness. Sullivan watched through his binoculars as one particular Sherman broke formation, charging directly toward the enemy position. "Who the hell is that?" he demanded. The radio man checked his log. "It's Captain Miller's tank, sir." Frank Miller, Sullivan's closest friend since officer training, a reckless son of a gun who never backed down from a fight. Now he was charging a vastly superior enemy force alone. "Get him on the radio. Tell him to fall back immediately." Sullivan watched as Miller's Sherman fired on the move, its shell bouncing harmlessly off the Tiger's thick frontal armor. The German tank didn't even slow down. Its massive gun adjusted slightly, almost casually, and fired. The impact lifted Miller's Sherman partially off the ground. When it crashed back down, flames were already consuming it. No one emerged from the hatches. Sullivan felt something inside him harden into cold resolve. They had trained together, fought together, planned their post-war futures together. Frank had a wife in Detroit and a 4-year-old daughter he'd seen only in photographs. "Sir," the radio man said quietly, "Command wants us to report our status." Sullivan took a deep breath. "Tell them we engaged superior enemy armor and suffered heavy casualties. Request immediate air support." As they pulled back to more defensible positions, Sullivan mentally calculated the losses. 12 Shermans destroyed, over 40 men dead or wounded. And for what? They had barely scratched the German armor. Hours later, after the surviving wounded had been evacuated and replacement tanks had begun to arrive, Sullivan sat alone in his command tent. On his field desk lay a half-written letter to Frank's wife. Words failed him. How could he explain that her husband's tank never stood a chance? That the mighty American war machine had sent men into battle with inadequate weapons? Sullivan pulled out his notebook and began writing furiously. Not a condolence letter, but an analysis. Detailed observations of the German armor's capabilities compared to their own. Shell penetration estimates. Effective combat ranges. He wrote until his hand cramped, then continued writing. "Captain Sullivan?" A young lieutenant stood at the tent entrance. "Yes, Lieutenant? Message from headquarters, sir. You've been recalled to Washington. Priority transport leaves at 0600 hours. Sullivan looked down at his notes, then back at the lieutenant. "Did they say why?" "No, sir, just that it came from the top. General Palmer himself." Sullivan nodded slowly. "Thank you, Lieutenant." After the messenger left, Sullivan returned to his notes, adding final observations and recommendations. He didn't know why he was being summoned back to Washington, but he knew what he would say when he got there. This couldn't continue. Something had to change, or more good men like Frank Miller would die for nothing. Chapter 3. Meeting at the Pentagon. The Pentagon's endless corridors felt like a different universe compared to the mud and blood of the front lines. Sullivan's uniform, hastily cleaned and pressed, still carried the faint smell of cordite. 3 days of rapid transport had brought him from the fields of Normandy to the heart of American military power, with barely enough time to process the transition. A young aide led Sullivan through the labyrinthine building. "General Palmer is expecting you, sir. The others are already assembled." "Others?" Sullivan asked, but the aide merely opened a door and gestured for him to enter. The conference room fell silent as Sullivan walked in. Around a large oak table sat 8 men in various military uniforms adorned with stars and eagles. At the head of the table, General Walter Palmer, whose reputation as a forward-thinking commander was well known throughout the Army, nodded slightly in greeting. "Captain Sullivan," Palmer said, his voice carrying the gravelly texture of a lifetime smoker. "Thank you for coming so quickly. Please have a seat." Sullivan took the only empty chair, acutely aware of the scrutiny from the assembled officers. He recognized a few faces from newsreels and military publications, men whose decisions shaped the course of the war from thousands of miles away. "Gentlemen, Captain Sullivan commanded a Sherman tank company at Normandy," Palmer began. "He's here to provide a first-hand account of our armor's performance against German Panthers and Tigers." A silver-haired general with 3 stars on each shoulder leaned forward. "We've read your preliminary report, Captain. Quite thorough, but I'd like to hear your assessment directly." Sullivan cleared his throat. "Sir, our tanks are being outgunned, outarmored, and outmaneuvered. The Sherman 75mm gun cannot reliably penetrate a Panther's frontal armor beyond 600 yards. Their 75mm can punch through our armor at 1,500 yards or more. And yet we continued to advance, another general interjected. We're pushing the Germans back across France. With respect, sir, we're doing it at an unacceptable cost in men and machines. For every Panther we knock out, we're losing 4 or 5 Shermans. My men call them Ronson lighters because of how quickly they catch fire when hit. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Palmer broke it by spreading several photographs on the table. These arrived yesterday from Ardennes Proving Ground, he said, the first operational prototype of the M36 tank destroyer. Sullivan leaned forward to study the images. The vehicle looks similar to the M10 tank destroyer already in service, but with a significantly larger gun mounted in its turret. The M36 mounts the 90mm M3 gun, Palmer explained. Initial tests show it can penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards, and its armor-piercing capabilities improved dramatically with the new HVAP tungsten core ammunition. The silver-haired general shook his head. It's still not a proper heavy tank. Open turret, inadequate armor. The design is fundamentally flawed. With respect, General Whitmore, Palmer countered, we don't have time to design and field a proper heavy tank. The Pershing is still months away from deployment readiness. Our men are dying now. Sullivan studied the photographs more carefully, his engineer's mind cataloging the features. It wasn't beautiful or groundbreaking, but it looked functional. Most importantly, that 90mm gun might give American forces a fighting chance against German armor. What exactly are you proposing, General? Another officer asked. Palmer gestured to Sullivan. I'm proposing we fast-track the M36 into production and deployment. Captain Sullivan would be promoted to major and tasked with forming the first operational M36 battalion. He would develop tactics, train crews, and prepare them for immediate deployment to Europe. Sullivan's head snapped up in surprise. This wasn't what he had expected when summoned to Washington. General Whitmore's face darkened. Absolutely not. We've already committed to increased Sherman production. Disrupting that now would be catastrophic for supply chains. No one's suggesting disrupting Sherman production, Palmer said calmly. The M36 uses the same chassis as the M10, which we're already building. We're simply putting a more powerful gun on an existing platform. The debate escalated, with Palmer and Whitmore representing opposite sides of a fundamental strategic disagreement. Sullivan listened carefully, understanding that he was witnessing a pivotal moment in American armor doctrine. Numbers will overcome quality, Whitmore insisted. That's the American way. We overwhelm the enemy with production capacity. Not when each Panther can knock out 5 Shermans before they get close enough to threaten it, Palmer countered. Not when brave men are burning alive inside inadequate machines. As the argument continued, Sullivan noticed a document at the bottom of the pile that had caught his attention. Casualty estimates for projected operations using current Sherman tanks versus hypothetical operations using M36 tank destroyers. The difference was stark. Thousands of lives potentially saved. Finally, the most senior officer present, a 4-star general who had remained silent throughout the debate, raised his hand. The room immediately fell quiet. I've heard enough, he said simply. General Palmer, you have 90 days. If your M36 program can demonstrate tactical effectiveness in that time, we'll commence full production and deployment. If not, we continue as planned with Sherman variants. He turned to Sullivan. Captain, are you willing to take on this assignment? Sullivan thought of Frank Miller's burning tank, of the letter to his widow that still remained unfinished. Yes, sir, I am. Then effective immediately, you are promoted to major. You'll report directly to General Palmer. This project is classified. Outside this room, it doesn't exist. As the meeting adjourned, General Whitmore approached Sullivan. You're being set up to fail, son. When this boondoggle collapses, it'll take your career with it. Sullivan met his gaze steadily. With respect, sir, I've seen what happens when we fail on the battlefield. I'll take my chances here. After the others had filed out, Palmer handed Sullivan a folder stamped top secret. Ardennes Proving Ground, Palmer said. You'll find everything we have on the M36 in there. Your priority is forming a crew for the prototype. These men will become the instructors for the entire program. Sullivan accepted this folder. I'll need the best men available. Take whoever you need, Palmer replied. But remember, we only have 90 days before the next major offensive begins in Europe. If the M36 isn't ready by then, he didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew what was at stake, not just a military program, but American lives. One more thing, Major, Palmer added, his voice softening slightly. I knew Frank Miller. We served together before the war. He was a good man. Sullivan nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Make sure his sacrifice wasn't in vain. Chapter 4. Selecting the best. Aberdeen Proving Ground sprawled across the Maryland landscape like an industrial city dedicated to the art of warfare. Sullivan arrived as morning fog still clung to the testing ranges, softening the outlines of various vehicles and artillery pieces positioned throughout the facility. His new oak leaf insignia felt strange on his collar, the promotion still not quite real in his mind. Colonel Howard Reeves, the base commander, greeted Sullivan at the administrative building. Welcome to Aberdeen, Major. General Palmer briefed me on your assignment. I've arranged for you to review personnel files in the secure conference room. Thank you, Colonel. I'd also like to see the M36 prototype as soon as possible. Reeves nodded. It's in the restricted hangar. I'll have someone take you there after you've had time with the files. For the next 3 hours, Sullivan immersed himself in personnel records. He wasn't looking for perfect soldiers with spotless records. He needed men with specific skills and experience who could form the core of an elite tank destroyer crew. Men who thought differently, who could adapt to the fluid nature of armored combat. By midday, he had narrowed his list to a dozen candidates. Before making final selections, he wanted to see the machine they would be operating. The M36 sat in the center of the hangar, its presence commanding attention despite its utilitarian design. Sullivan walked a slow circle around it, noting the similarities to the M10 tank destroyer, but his eyes kept returning to the massive 90mm gun protruding from its turret. "She's not much to look at," said a voice from behind him, "but that cannon changes everything." Sullivan turned to find a weathered older man in grease-stained coveralls studying him with frank curiosity. Despite the civilian attire, his bearing screamed military. "And you are?" Sullivan asked. "William Harrington. Most folks call me Wild Bill." The man wiped his hand on a rag before extending it. "Chief mechanic on this project." Sullivan shook his hand, noting the powerful grip and calloused palm. "Major James Sullivan. I'm assembling a crew for field testing." Harrington's eyebrows rose. "You look too young to be a major." "Battlefield promotion," Sullivan said simply. Understanding passed between them. No further explanation was needed. "What do you think of her?" Harrington gestured to the M36. Sullivan ran his hand along the turret's edge. "It's not about looks. It's about effectiveness. Can this gun penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at combat range?" "That and more," Harrington confirmed. "I've been working on tanks since they first rolled off American assembly lines. This 90mm is something special, especially with the new tungsten core rounds." He paused. "Problem is, they're treating it like just another tank destroyer. It's more than that." Sullivan studied the man with newfound interest. "How so?" "It's an answer to a specific problem. German armor superiority. The brass wants to use it like the M10, but it's capable of so much more with the right tactics." "You sound like you've given this some thought." Harrington shrugged. "Been working on these machines for 30 years. You learn to see their potential." Sullivan made a decision on the spot. "I need a driver for my test crew, someone who understands these machines inside and out." Harrington eyed him skeptically. "I'm 48 years old, Major. Been out of the service for years. They only brought me back as a civilian consultant because I worked on the Indianapolis racing circuit before the war." "Perfect," Sullivan said. "You've got experience nobody else has. I need that. The Army won't like it." "Let me worry about the Army." By that evening, Sullivan had finalized his crew selections. Besides Harrington, he chose Sergeant Eddie Thomas, a former deer hunting champion from Montana, whose marksmanship scores were off the charts. For the loader position, he selected Corporal Robert Martinez, an engineering student from MIT who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor. And for radio operation and secondary gunner duties, Private First Class John Walker, a steelworker's son from Pennsylvania whose technical aptitude tests were among the highest on record. When they assembled in the briefing room the next morning, Sullivan studied his hand-picked team. Harrington weathered and skeptical. Thomas, lean and watchful with the quiet confidence of a natural marksman. Martinez, intelligent eyes taking in every detail. Walker, young and eager, barely containing his excitement. "Gentlemen," Sullivan began, "what I'm about to tell you is classified. You were selected for this unit because you each bring unique skills to the table." He paused, making eye contact with each man. "We have 90 days to prove that the M36 tank destroyer can effectively counter German armor superiority on the battlefield. If we succeed, thousands of American lives may be saved. If we fail..." He let the sentence hang in the air. They were smart enough to understand the implications. Harrington was the first to speak. addressing Sullivan directly. With respect, Major, what qualifies you to lead this project? You're an armor officer, not an engineer. The question might have seemed insubordinate from anyone else, but Sullivan recognized it as legitimate concern. These men deserved honesty. Before the war, I was a mechanical engineer at Ford Motor Company, Sullivan replied. I specialized in drivetrain systems, but my qualification for this mission isn't my engineering background. His voice hardened. 2 weeks ago, I watched German tanks destroy my company in France. I watched good men die because our equipment couldn't match theirs. That's my qualification. The room fell silent. Sullivan could see the shift in their expressions, particularly in Harrington's eyes. Now, Sullivan continued, let's talk about what we're dealing with. The M36 mounts the 90mm M3 gun, the same weapon being developed for the Pershing heavy tank. It uses the same chassis as the M10, which means familiar mechanics and logistics. The open turret design reduces weight and improves visibility, though it leaves the crew more exposed. He spread technical drawings on the table. Our mission is twofold. First, ensure the M36 functions as intended in combat conditions. Second, develop tactics that maximize its capabilities against German armor. Martinez studied the drawings intently. The muzzle velocity on the 90mm is impressive. With the right ammunition, it should have excellent penetration characteristics. That's where things get complicated, Sullivan acknowledged. The most effective rounds require tungsten cores, and tungsten is in short supply. We'll have limited quantities of the high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition. So we make every shot count, Thomas said quietly, speaking for the first time. His voice carried the slight drawl of the Mountain West. 1 round, 1 kill. Exactly, Sullivan confirmed. The M36 isn't designed for prolonged engagements. It's built to strike hard from advantageous positions, then relocate before the enemy can respond. Walker raised his hand. Sir, how soon will we begin actual training with the vehicle? Tomorrow, Sullivan replied. Today you familiarize yourselves with the technical specifications. I want each of you to understand this machine as if you built it yourselves. As the briefing concluded and the men began reviewing the materials, Sullivan noticed Harrington lingering behind. Something on your mind, Sergeant? Sullivan asked, having arranged for Harrington's temporary recommissioning. Just wondering if you know what you've gotten yourself into, Harrington replied. General Whitmore has a lot of influence. If he wants his project to fail, he'll make sure it does. Sullivan nodded slowly. I'm counting on it. You want opposition? I want my crew prepared for every possible challenge, Sullivan explained. Because when we reach Europe, the Germans won't be setting us up to succeed. Harrington studied him with newfound respect. You're not what I expected, Major. What did you expect? Some headquarters officer playing at being a tanker. But you've seen the real thing, haven't you? Sullivan's mind flashed to Miller's burning tank. Yes, and I don't intend to see it again. Chapter 5. The Vehicle Changing the War. Dawn broke over Aberdeen Proving Ground, painting the eastern sky in shades of orange and gold. Sullivan stood beside the M36 prototype, watching as his newly formed crew approached. Each man moved differently. Harrington with the deliberate pace of someone conserving energy for a long day's work. Thomas with the measured steps of a hunter. Martinez with academic precision. Young Walker almost bouncing with barely contained enthusiasm. Gentlemen, Sullivan greeted them, meet your new home. The M36 tank destroyer sat on the concrete pad, its 90mm gun elevated slightly. In the early morning light, with dew still clinging to its angular surfaces, it projected a sense of lethal purpose. Doesn't look much different from an M10 from the outside, Thomas observed. The difference is inside, Sullivan replied. Specifically that 90mm M3 gun. Let's get acquainted with our new weapon. For the next hour, Sullivan took them through every aspect of the vehicle, from the Ford GAA V8 engine that Harrington examined with professional appreciation, to the gunner's position where Thomas familiarized himself with the sighting mechanisms. Martinez studied the loading system with methodical attention, while Walker explored the radio equipment in secondary machine gun position. The open turret design has advantages and disadvantages, Sullivan explained, standing inside the fighting compartment. It reduces weight, improves observation, and makes communication easier. The downside is obvious. Limited protection from artillery fragments, snipers, or air bursts. Fair trade for getting that 90mm mounted on a mobile platform, Harrington commented from the driver's position. Closed turret would have required a complete redesign of the chassis. Sullivan nodded. Exactly. This is about getting a solution to the field now, not waiting for perfection. He handed each man a classified document. These are the performance specifications for the 90mm M3 gun, including penetration data for various ammunition types at different ranges. Martinez whistled softly as he studied the figures. With standard APC rounds, we can penetrate a Panther's turret front at 1,000 yards. With HVAP rounds, we could take on a Tiger's frontal armor at combat ranges. Which explains the limited supply of HVAP, Thomas added. Tungsten is needed for aircraft production and machine tools. Sullivan was pleased with how quickly they grasped the implications. This changes our tactical approach. Sherman crews often have to close to dangerously short ranges to be effective against German armor. The M36 can engage from standoff distances that keep us outside their effective range. Walker looked up from his document. Sir, these penetration tables show we could hit a Panther from positions where they couldn't effectively return fire. That's a game changer. It is, Sullivan agreed, but only if we develop the right tactics and train properly. Let's begin with basic operations today. Each of you will learn every position, though you'll specialize in your assigned roles. The morning progressed with mechanical familiarization. Harrington demonstrated the transmission and steering system, explaining the nuances of the vehicle's handling characteristics. Thomas familiarized himself with the gun's elevation and traversing mechanisms, while Martinez practiced loading procedures with dummy rounds. By midday, Sullivan called a break. As the men sat in the shade of a nearby maintenance hangar, eating field rations, he observed their interactions. Already, a sense of camaraderie was developing. Harrington sharing stories from his racing days, Thomas demonstrating proper breath control for long-range shooting, Martinez explaining the physics behind armor penetration, Walker absorbing it all with youthful enthusiasm. After lunch, they moved to the gunnery range. With Sullivan's authorization, they would fire live rounds for the first time. As they prepared the vehicle, a staff car approached. Sullivan recognized the passenger immediately. "Attention on deck," he called as Major General Richards, Aberdeen's commanding officer, stepped from the vehicle. "As you were," Richards said, approaching the group. "I wanted to see how Palmer's pet project is progressing." His tone made clear his skepticism. Sullivan made introductions, then explained the day's objectives. "We're conducting initial live fire exercises to establish baseline accuracy data, sir." Richards nodded, though his expression remained dubious. "You're aware that General Whitmore has requested daily progress reports? He seems particularly interested in any difficulties you might encounter." "I'm not surprised, sir," Sullivan replied evenly. "We welcome the scrutiny. The M36 will prove its worth through performance, not politics." Richards studied Sullivan for a moment. "Bold statement, Major. Let's see if you can back it up." He gestured toward the firing range. "Carry on." With the general observing, Sullivan felt the pressure intensify. His crew needed to perform flawlessly. Thomas took his position as gunner, with Martinez ready to load and Sullivan himself serving as commander. "Range 800 yards, Sullivan ordered. Standard APC round. Target is the Panther hull mock-up." Martinez loaded the shell with practiced efficiency. Thomas adjusted his sights, compensating for wind and distance. "Ready, sir," Thomas reported. "Fire when ready." Thomas squeezed the trigger. The 90mm roared, the vehicle rocking slightly with the recoil. Through his binoculars, Sullivan watched as the shell struck the target almost dead center on the Panther's simulated turret. "Hit," he announced, unable to keep a note of satisfaction from his voice. For the next hour, they fired at various targets at increasing ranges. Each shot reinforced what the specifications had promised. The 90mm gun was devastatingly accurate and powerful, capable of defeating simulated German armor at ranges that would have been impossible for a standard Sherman. When they finished, General Richards approached again. His expression had shifted from skepticism to guarded interest. "Impressive shooting," he acknowledged, "but hitting stationary targets on a range is a far cry from combat conditions." "Absolutely, sir," Sullivan agreed. "That's why we'll be progressing to more complex scenarios, moving targets, limited visibility, rapid deployment drills. We need to simulate battlefield conditions as realistically as possible." Richards nodded slowly. "I'm not convinced this is the right approach, Sullivan. The Army has invested heavily in Sherman production, but I can't deny the gun's effectiveness." He glanced at the smoking targets downrange. "You've got my authorization to continue the program. For now." After the general departed, Sullivan gathered his crew. "That was just the beginning, gentlemen. Tomorrow we start developing actual combat tactics. The M36 isn't just a more powerful tank destroyer, it represents a new approach to armored warfare. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the proving grounds, Sullivan remained beside the M36, making notes in his field book. Harrington approached, wiping engine grease from his hands. "Been checking the powertrain," he said. "Engine's running hot. The 90mm puts more strain on the chassis than it was originally designed for." Sullivan looked up from his notes. "Can it be fixed?" "Already working on it," Harrington replied. "Cooling system needs modification. Nothing major, but it'll take time." Sullivan nodded. "Time is the one thing we don't have much of." He closed his notebook. "What do you think of our chances, honestly?" Harrington considered the question carefully. "The gun works. Better than expected. The platform is solid, if not ideal. With the right tactics and training, this thing could save a lot of lives." He paused. "But Whitmore and his crowd won't make it easy. They've got too much invested in the status quo." "Politics," Sullivan said with a hint of disgust. "War is politics with bullets," Harrington replied. "Always has been." As they stood in companionable silence, a messenger approached with an envelope bearing General Palmer's seal. Sullivan read the contents, his expression darkening. "What is it?" Harrington asked. Sullivan handed him the message. It was brief and to the point. General Whitmore had persuaded the War Department to reduce the M36 program's budget by 30%, citing resource allocation priorities. "They're trying to kill it before it begins," Harrington observed. Sullivan's jaw tightened. "They'll have to try harder than that." He took back the message, folding it carefully. "We adapt. We overcome. We prove them wrong." "How?" "By making this vehicle too valuable to ignore." Sullivan looked at the M36, its silhouette now a dark shape against the fading light. "Tomorrow we begin tactical development in earnest. Tell the men to rest well tonight. From now on, we're in a race against time." As Harrington departed, Sullivan remained alone with the M36. In its utilitarian design, he saw not just a weapon, but a potential lifeline for countless American tank crews. Men like Frank Miller, who deserved a fighting chance against superior German armor. "We'll make it work," he promised quietly. "Whatever it takes." Back in the present, Lieutenant Colonel James Sullivan paused in his storytelling. The afternoon had progressed to early evening, and shadows lengthened across his study. David had listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions about technical details, but mostly absorbing his grandfather's tale with rapt attention. "So that was the beginning," David said. "But how did you overcome the budget cuts and the political opposition?" Sullivan smiled faintly. "That was just the first challenge. There were many more to come." He glanced at the photograph on his desk, the 5 men standing proudly beside their tank destroyer. "We had 90 days to prove the M36 could change the war. 90 days to develop an entirely new approach to armored combat. And did you?" "That's a story for another time," Sullivan replied, rising from his chair. "But I'll tell you this much. What we created wasn't just a tank destroyer. It was a philosophy, American ingenuity adapting to overcome a specific threat. Not the perfect solution, but the right solution at the right time." He picked up the photograph, studying the faces of men who had become more than crew members. Men who had become family in the crucible of war. "The Germans had better tanks," Sullivan continued, his voice taking on a reflective quality. "Bigger guns, thicker armor, but we had something they didn't." "What was that?" David asked. Sullivan placed the photograph back on his desk, angled so the fading light caught the determined faces of his long-ago crew. "Adaptability," he said simply. "The willingness to admit when something isn't working and change course quickly. To find solutions rather than excuses." He smiled at his grandson. "That's the real American advantage. Not our industrial might or our resources, though those certainly helped. It was our ability to look reality in the face, acknowledge our shortcomings, and then overcome them through innovation and sheer determination." David nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "That's why you encouraged me to study engineering. It's not just about building things. It's about solving problems." "Exactly," Sullivan confirmed. "The M36 wasn't the best tank destroyer ever built, but it was exactly what we needed when we needed it most. Sometimes that's the highest form of engineering excellence." Outside, darkness had fallen. The old clock on the mantel chimed 7 times. "Stay for dinner," Sullivan offered. "And afterward, I'll tell you about our first tactical development exercises, about how we created a new combat doctrine while fighting against time, bureaucracy, and our own military's resistance to change." "I'd like that," David replied, his expression thoughtful. Very much. As they moved toward the dining room, Sullivan cast one last glance at the photograph. For a moment, he could almost hear the rumble of the M36's engine, feel the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, sense the determination of his crew to prove the doubters wrong. Those 90 days had changed the course of the war for countless American tank crews, and they had changed him forever. The morning mist rolled across the Ardennes testing grounds like a phantom army, shrouding the landscape in gray. Major James Sullivan stood atop a small rise, field glasses pressed to his eyes as he watched the silhouette of the M36 tank destroyer emerge from the fog. Even at this distance, the distinctive profile of the 90mm gun cut an imposing figure against the lightning sky. 3 weeks had passed since their first test firing. 3 weeks of 18-hour days, mechanical adjustments, and intensive training. Sullivan watched as the vehicle executed a precise flanking maneuver, moving with surprising agility for its size. Sergeant William Harrington had performed miracles with the transmission system, coaxing better performance from the powertrain than the original designers had thought possible. Sullivan checked his stopwatch as the M36 reached its firing position, traversed its turret, and fired in one fluid sequence. The thunderous report of the 90mm gun echoed across the proving ground. Through his binoculars, Sullivan observed the direct hit on a simulated Panther tank positioned 1,200 yards away. Even at this distance, he could see that the shell had penetrated precisely where Thomas had aimed it, at the turret ring, one of the Panther's few vulnerable points. "Impressive," commented a voice behind him. Sullivan turned to find Colonel James Richardson, the head of the Armored Tactics Division, standing with a small delegation of officers. Their presence was no accident. Today's demonstration had been carefully orchestrated to showcase the M36's capabilities to key decision-makers. "Thank you, sir," Sullivan replied. "We're demonstrating what we call shoot and scoot tactics. The M36 engages from advantageous positions at standoff range, then immediately relocates to avoid counter-battery fire." As they watched, the tank destroyer was already on the move, disappearing behind a ridgeline before the echo of its shot had fully dissipated. "Conventional tank doctrine emphasizes direct engagement," Richardson observed. "Your approach seems more akin to artillery tactics." "With respect, sir, that's exactly the point," Sullivan explained. "The M36 isn't designed to slug it out with Panthers and Tigers. It's designed to engage them from positions of advantage, using its superior gun to defeat their armor before they can effectively return fire." Richardson made a non-committal noise, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. "Your 90-day clock is ticking, Major. General Whitmore remains convinced that Sherman numerical superiority is the correct approach. Numbers mean little if Panthers can destroy Shermans before they get within effective range," Sullivan countered. He handed Richardson a folder. "These are our engagement analytics from the past 3 weeks. The M36 consistently penetrates Panther-equivalent armor at ranges exceeding 1,200 yards. The Sherman 76mm gun struggles to do so at half that distance." The M36 had reappeared on another ridge, firing again, another direct hit on a different target. Richardson studied the data with professional interest. "You're developing an entirely new tactical doctrine for these vehicles." "We have to," Sullivan affirmed. "The M36 has different capabilities and limitations compared to traditional tanks or even other tank destroyers. Using it with conventional tactics would waste its potential." Before Richardson could respond, the sound of an approaching vehicle drew their attention. A staff car pulled up, and out stepped Major Richard Porter, an aide to General Whitmore and an outspoken critic of the M36 program. "Major Sullivan," Porter greeted with barely concealed disdain. "I see you're putting on quite a show today." "Just demonstrating actual combat tactics, Major," Sullivan replied evenly. "Would you care to observe from the command position, get a first-hand perspective?" Porter's expression suggested he'd rather eat glass, but with Richardson watching, he could hardly refuse. "I suppose that would be appropriate for my report." 10 minutes later, Porter was seated uncomfortably in the commander's position of the M36 as Harrington navigated a challenging section of terrain. Sullivan had instructed his crew to execute a particularly demanding fire and movement exercise, one they had perfected over the past weeks. "Target identified," Thomas announced from the gunner's position. "Panther analog at bearing 045, range estimated 1,300 yards. "Confirmed," Sullivan replied from his position behind Porter. "Engage when ready." The vehicle came to a brief halt. Thomas made rapid adjustments to his sight. Martinez loaded a practice round with fluid efficiency. "On target," Thomas reported. "Fire," Sullivan ordered. The 90 millimeter gun roared, the concussion in the confined space of the open turret far more intense than Porter had anticipated. He flinched visibly. Hit, Sullivan confirmed through his binoculars. Direct penetration through the turret face. Now relocate immediately. Harrington was already moving, sending the vehicle reversing down the slope they had just ascended, then executing a tight turn that threw Porter against the turret ring. Is this really necessary? Porter demanded, his carefully maintained uniform now smudged with grease. In combat, absolutely, Sullivan replied. German counter-battery fire would target our previous position within seconds. Movement equals survival. Porter endured another 20 minutes of similar maneuvers before demanding to be returned to the observation point. As he departed, Sullivan could hear him muttering about cowboy tactics and irresponsible use of equipment. Richardson had watched the entire exercise with careful attention. As Sullivan rejoined him, the colonel's expression was thoughtful. Your crew performs exceptionally well together, he noted, but I question whether your tactics can be effectively taught to regular Army units in a reasonable time frame. Sullivan had anticipated this concern. That's precisely why we're developing a comprehensive training program alongside our tactical doctrine. Each M36 crew will undergo specialized instruction before deployment. Richardson nodded slowly. I'm not completely convinced, Sullivan, but I'm intrigued. He glanced at his watch. I have to return to Washington. My report will reflect what I've observed today, both positive and negative. After Richardson and his staff departed, Sullivan rejoined his crew as they conducted maintenance on the M36. Despite the grueling schedule, morale remained high. Each man had embraced the mission with a sense of purpose that transcended ordinary duty. How'd the brass like our little demonstration? Harrington asked, wiping grease from his hands. Richardson seemed interested. Porter looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. Thomas smiled slightly as he cleaned the breech of the 90 millimeter. That's because Porter's never been in combat against a Panther. He doesn't understand what we're up against. Sullivan nodded grimly, which is why our documentation needs to be impeccable. Data speaks when experience is lacking. Martinez approached with a notebook filled with calculations. Sir, I've been analyzing our hit probabilities at extended ranges. With the new ballistic tables I've developed, we can increase first-round hit probability by 17% at ranges beyond 1,000 yards. Sullivan reviewed the calculations, impressed by the corporal's thoroughness. Excellent work, Martinez. This is exactly the kind of innovation we need. As evening approached, Sullivan gathered his crew for a briefing on the next day's activities. Tomorrow we face our biggest challenge yet, the formal evaluation firing test. General Palmer will be here, along with representatives from the War Department. And Whitmore? Harrington asked. Most certainly, Sullivan confirmed. This is our moment, gentlemen. Everything we've worked for comes down to tomorrow's demonstration. After dismissing the crew, Sullivan remained alone with the M36. In the fading light, he studied its utilitarian form. Not beautiful or elegant like some weapons, but purposeful, designed for a specific job, just like his crew. Reaching into his pocket, Sullivan withdrew a worn photograph of Frank Miller and his family, the friend whose death had set him on this path. We're getting there, Frank, he murmured. We're going to make sure what happened to you doesn't happen to others. As darkness fell over Aberdeen, Sullivan made his way to the officers' quarters, mind racing with final preparations for tomorrow's crucial test. The 90-day clock was ticking, and the lives of countless American tankers hung in the balance. Chapter 7. The First Trial. Dawn broke clear in a cold over Aberdeen Proving Ground. A light frost coated the ground, glittering in the first rays of sunlight. Major James Sullivan had been awake for hours, reviewing test protocols and checking equipment. Today would determine whether the M36 program continued or died on the vine. The observation stand had been prepared for distinguished visitors. General Palmer would be present, along with representatives from Ordnance Department, Ground Forces Command, and various technical bureaus. Most significantly, General Whitmore himself would attend, no doubt hoping to witness the program's failure. Sullivan's crew arrived at the maintenance hangar before sunrise. Each man moved with quiet purpose, performing final checks on their vehicle with meticulous care. Harrington had spent half the night making adjustments to the cooling system. Thomas cleaned his optics repeatedly, ensuring perfect clarity. Martinez organized his ammunition stores with mathematical precision. Young Walker tested the radio equipment, then double-checked the machine gun mounts. Gentlemen, Sullivan addressed them as they completed preparations. Today we demonstrate not just a new weapon, but a new approach to armored combat. Remember your training, trust your equipment and each other. Questions? There were none. Each man knew his role. At precisely 0800 hours, the delegation arrived. Sullivan recognized General Palmer immediately, noting the grim set of his features. Beside him walked General Whitmore, his expression one of barely concealed skepticism. Behind them came a collection of colonels, majors, and technical specialists, clipboards and notepads in hand. "Major Sullivan," Palmer greeted him. "Your vehicle is prepared?" "Yes, sir. Crew and equipment standing by." Whitmore interjected without preamble. "Let's be clear about today's parameters, Sullivan. This isn't a theatrical demonstration. We're evaluating practical combat effectiveness against specific criteria." Sullivan nodded calmly. "Of course, General. We welcome rigorous assessment." The test protocol had been established weeks earlier. The M36 would demonstrate mobility, firepower, and tactical flexibility through a series of increasingly difficult challenges. Success would be measured against predetermined benchmarks for accuracy, time, and effectiveness. As the officials took their places in the observation stand, Sullivan joined his crew at the M36. "Remember, this isn't just about hitting targets. It's about demonstrating a complete combat system." The men nodded, their faces set with determination. Sullivan took his position in the commander's hatch. "Driver, advance to start position." Harrington engaged the transmission, and the M36 moved forward with surprising smoothness, taking its place at the starting line marked on the proving ground. A signal flare arced into the sky. Test had begun. The first phase involved a mobility course designed to evaluate the M36's handling characteristics under combat conditions. Harrington navigated the vehicle through a series of obstacles, demonstrating its maneuverability despite the heavy 90mm gun. Sullivan could see the surprise on some observers' faces as the tank destroyer negotiated tight turns in difficult terrain with unexpected agility. Next came the stationary firing test. At ranges from 500 to 1,500 yards, Thomas engaged targets representing various German armored vehicles. The 90mm gun performed flawlessly, Martinez loading with practiced efficiency as Thomas placed round after round precisely on target. Sullivan monitored the reaction of the observers through his binoculars. Most were taking notes with increasing interest. Even Whitmore's perpetual frown had deepened into a look of grudging attention. The third phase presented the greatest challenge, engaging moving targets while the M36 itself was in motion. This required perfect coordination between Harrington's driving and Thomas's gunnery, with Sullivan calling adjustments based on his observations. "Target Panther analog moving right to left at approximately 15 miles per hour, range 900 yards, Sullivan called. Thomas made rapid calculations, adjusting for both their movement and the targets. "On target. Fire when ready," the 90mm boomed. Through his binoculars, Sullivan watched the round strike the moving target dead center. "Hit," he confirmed. "Driver, change position immediately." Harrington was already moving, taking the M36 on a pre-planned, evasive route to a new firing position. Within 90 seconds, they were ready to engage again. Throughout the morning, the crew performed with machine-like precision. Each challenge was met and overcome, each target engaged and destroyed. By the time the final test phase concluded, Sullivan knew they had exceeded the established benchmarks by significant margins. As the M36 returned to the assembly area, the crew maintained their professional demeanor. But Sullivan could sense their quiet pride. They had performed flawlessly under immense pressure. The technical evaluation team immediately surrounded the vehicle, measuring barrel temperature, examining the suspension system, and collecting performance data. Sullivan allowed them their professional curiosity while he made his way to where the generals stood in conversation. "Impressive shooting, Major," Palmer acknowledged as Sullivan approached. "Your gunner has remarkable skill." "Thank you, sir. Sergeant Thomas is exceptionally talented, but it's the entire crew working as a unit that makes the difference." Whitmore had been studying a data sheet handed to him by one of the technical officers. "The penetration values are certainly notable," he conceded reluctantly, "but a controlled demonstration hardly replicates battlefield conditions, which is why we've developed specific tactical doctrine to maximize the M36's strengths and minimize its vulnerabilities," Sullivan replied, handing Whitmore a bound document. "Our complete tactical assessment and recommended deployment parameters." Whitmore accepted this document with obvious reluctance. "I'll review it, Major, but I remain concerned about production logistics. Retooling for the 90mm gun represents a significant resource allocation." Palmer intervened smoothly. "The Ordnance Department has already confirmed that existing M10 production lines can be adapted with minimal disruption." He turned to Sullivan. Major, please have your crew ready the vehicle for the second phase of testing, the live fire evaluation against captured German armor. Sullivan saluted and returned to his crew, who had been watching the exchange from a discreet distance. "How'd it go, sir?" Walker asked anxiously. "Whitmore's not convinced, but he's listening," Sullivan replied. "Now comes the real test. They're bringing out the captured Panther." During the brief break, Sullivan's crew performed quick maintenance checks while consuming field rations. The morning's performance had been flawless, but the afternoon would present the ultimate challenge, engaging actual German armor. The captured Panther tank had been recovered relatively intact from the Normandy battlefield. While not operational, its armor protection remained unchanged, providing a perfect test subject for the M36's penetration capabilities. As preparations for the live fire test continued, an unexpected visitor approached Sullivan. Colonel Howard Richardson, one of the Army's foremost experts on armor development. "Major Sullivan," Richardson greeted him, "your demonstration this morning was most illuminating." "Thank you, Colonel. I hope it addressed some of the concerns about the M36's capabilities." Richardson nodded thoughtfully. "Technically, the vehicle performed beyond expectations, but I'm more interested in your tactical innovations." He tapped the bound document Sullivan had provided earlier. "Your shoot and scoot doctrine represents a significant departure from established armored warfare principles. The realities of the European battlefield demand new approaches," Sullivan explained. "When facing superior armor protection, we must leverage superior gunnery and mobility." "A controversial perspective," Richardson noted, "but one supported by your results today." Their conversation was interrupted by the announcement that the live fire test would commence in 15 minutes. Sullivan rejoined his crew, finding them gathered around the M36 in quiet conversation. "Nervous?" he asked, noting the tension in their postures. "Not about the shooting, sir," Thomas replied. "About what comes after. If we succeed today, we'll be deploying to Europe soon." Sullivan understood. These men had become more than a crew during their intensive training. They had become a family of sorts, bound by shared purpose and mutual respect. The prospect of combat brought that reality into sharp focus. "One step at a time," Sullivan advised. "Let's make sure the M36 gets the chance to prove itself where it matters most." The live fire demonstration was arranged with clinical precision. The captured Panther had been positioned at a range of 1,000 yards, its thick frontal armor angled just as it would be in combat. Surrounding the tank were various instrumentation packages designed to measure impact force, penetration depth, and damage patterns. From the observation stand, General Whitmore himself announced the parameters. "Major Sullivan, your vehicle will engage the Panther target with standard armor-piercing, capped ballistic cap ammunition. You will fire at designated impact points as directed by the evaluation team." Sullivan acknowledged the instructions and relayed them to his crew. This would be a pure test of the 90mm gun's penetration capability against actual German armor, not simulations or estimates. The first designated aim point was the Panther's upper glacis plate, its most heavily armored section, sloped at 55 degrees to maximize effective thickness. Many Sherman rounds had shattered harmlessly against this formidable defense. "Gunner upper glacis plate, range 1,000 yards, Sullivan ordered. Thomas made his adjustments with careful precision. "On target, sir." "Load armor piercing." Martinez slid the massive shell into the breech with practiced efficiency. "Weapon ready," Thomas confirmed. Sullivan took a deep breath. "Fire." The 90mm gun roared, and Malmer's ready roared, its muzzle blast kicking up dust around the M36. Through his binoculars, Sullivan watched the shell strike the Panther exactly at the designated point. For a moment, he feared it had failed to penetrate, seeing no obvious damage. Then he noticed the small, neat hole punched through the legendary German armor. The evaluation team rushed to examine the impact site, taking measurements and photographs. The technical discussion that followed was animated, with much pointing and gesturing at the penetration hole. General Palmer approached the M36, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes revealing satisfaction. "Congratulations, Major. Your round penetrated the upper glacis completely. The technical team estimates it would have disabled the Panther's transmission and likely caused internal spalling that would have injured or killed crew members." Sullivan nodded, maintaining his professional demeanor despite the surge of vindication he felt. "Request permission to engage additional target points, sir." "Granted." The evaluation team has marked 3 more impact zones. Over the next hour, the M36 demonstrated its lethal effectiveness against different sections of the Panther's armor. Each shot penetrated successfully, confirming what Sullivan and his crew had worked so hard to prove. The 90 millimeter gun mounted on the M36 could defeat German armor at combat ranges. As the final evaluations were completed, Sullivan stood with his crew beside their vehicle, awaiting the official assessment. The technical teams were huddled with the generals, examining data and discussing results in low voices. Finally, General Palmer approached, followed by Whitmore and several staff officers. Major Sullivan, Palmer began formally. Based on today's demonstration, the evaluation committee has recommended that the M36 tank destroyer program proceed to full production status. A weight lifted from Sullivan's shoulders, though he maintained his military bearing. Thank you, sir. Whitmore stepped forward, his expression still skeptical but less hostile than before. There remain logistical challenges to address, Major. Production schedules, crew training protocols, deployment priorities. Your 90 days aren't up yet. We've prepared comprehensive documentation on all those aspects, General, Sullivan replied, and we're ready to address any specific concerns. Palmer intervened smoothly. Major Sullivan, have your crew secure the vehicle and report to the briefing room at 1600 hours. There are developments you should be aware of. As the officials departed, Sullivan turned to his crew. The men maintained their professional composure, but he could see the relief and pride in their eyes. Well done, gentlemen, he said simply. But remember, this is just the beginning. Harrington, the oldest and most experienced among them, nodded gravely. The real test is still to come, on the battlefield. Sullivan couldn't disagree. Today's success was meaningful, but ultimately it was just a waypoint on their journey. The true measure of the M36 would be taken in combat against the Panthers and Tigers that were decimating American armor across Europe. At precisely 1600 hours, Sullivan reported to the briefing room as ordered. He found General Palmer alone, studying a map of Western Europe spread across the conference table. Major, Palmer greeted him, close the door. Sullivan complied, sensing the gravity in Palmer's tone. The situation in Europe has deteriorated, Palmer began without preamble. German armor is inflicting heavy casualties on our tank battalions. The Ardennes offensive is stalled against Panther and Tiger concentrations that our Shermans cannot effectively engage. Sullivan felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. More American tankers dying because their equipment was outmatched. Palmer continued, based on today's demonstration, I've received authorization to accelerate the M36 program. The first production units will begin rolling off assembly lines within 2 weeks. That's excellent news, sir, Sullivan responded. There's more, Palmer said, his expression grave. You and your crew will not be returning to Washington. You're being deployed to Europe immediately to establish the first operational M36 battalion. You'll train crews in theater and develop combat tactics under actual battlefield conditions. Sullivan absorbed this information, understanding its implications. When do we leave, sir? 3 days, Palmer replied. Barely enough time to collect your equipment and personal effects. I know it's short notice, but the situation is critical. My men will be ready, sir. Palmer studied him for a moment. There's something else you should know. General Whitmore remains skeptical about the M36's battlefield effectiveness. He's arranged for a special observer to accompany your unit, Major Porter. Sullivan maintained his neutral expression despite his internal dismay. Porter was Whitmore's aide and shared his superior's dismissive attitude toward the M36 program. I understand, sir. Palmer's expression softened slightly. This is your chance to prove the M36's worth where it matters most, Sullivan. In combat. Succeed and you'll save countless American lives. Fail. He didn't need to finish the sentence. They both understood the stakes. We won't fail, sir, Sullivan assured him. Palmer nodded. I'm counting on that, Major. We all are. As Sullivan left the briefing room, his mind raced with the implications of their accelerated deployment. They would be heading directly into combat with minimal preparation time. Their training had been intensive, but nothing fully prepared men for the realities of the battlefield. He found his crew in the maintenance hangar, performing end-of-day checks on the M36. Their expressions turned questioning as they noted his serious demeanor. Gentlemen, he began, I have news. By the time Sullivan finished explaining their new orders, a heavy silence had fallen over the group. Each man processed the information in his own way. Harrington's weathered face showed grim resolution. Thomas cleaned his glasses methodically, a habit when deep in thought. Martinez made quick calculations in his notebook as if trying to quantify the challenges ahead. Young Walker's expression revealed a mixture of anxiety and excitement. 3 days isn't much time, Harrington observed. No, it isn't, Sullivan agreed, but it's all we have. We'll be establishing the first operational M36 battalion in the European theater, training crews, developing combat tactics, and engaging German armor directly. Will we have adequate ammunition supplies? Martinez asked practically, especially HVAP rounds. General Palmer has assured me we'll receive priority for tungsten allocation, but supplies will still be limited. We'll need to make every round count. Thomas spoke up, his voice quiet but firm. We've proven the M36 can penetrate Panther armor. Now we need to prove it can do so in combat conditions. Exactly, Sullivan confirmed. And we'll have an observer with us. Major Porter. Harrington grimaced. Whitmore's watchdog. Who will be looking for any reason to declare the program a failure, Sullivan added. Which means we can't give him one. The men exchanged glances, a silent communication born of weeks working in close proximity. We won't let you down, sir, Walker said, speaking for all of them. Sullivan nodded, feeling a surge of pride in these men who had become more than subordinates. I know you won't. Now let's prepare for deployment. We have much to accomplish in very little time. As the crew dispersed to begin preparations, Sullivan remained alone with the M36 for a moment. He placed his hand on the cold metal of the hull, feeling the solid construction beneath his palm. This machine, this crew, this mission had become the focus of his existence. The responsibility weighed heavily, but it also provided clarity of purpose he had never experienced before. In 3 days, they would be heading to Europe, into the heart of the conflict. The true test of the M36 was about to begin. Chapter 8, Ardennes Challenge. The bitter cold of the Ardennes forest penetrated layers of clothing, chilling flesh, and freezing breath into white clouds. Major James Sullivan stood atop the turret of his M36, field glasses pressed to his eyes as he surveyed the snow-covered landscape before him. 6 weeks had passed since their arrival in Europe. 6 weeks of intensive crew training, tactical development, and increasingly frequent combat engagements. The first operational M36 battalion had been formed around Sullivan's core crew, with 16 vehicles now deployed along this critical sector of the front. Behind them, American infantry units huddled in hastily dug foxholes, grateful for the presence of the tank destroyers that had already proven their worth against German armor. Movement at the tree line, Thomas reported from his position beside Sullivan. His sniper's eyes had detected what Sullivan's glasses were only now revealing, the subtle shifting of shadows that indicated enemy activity. Sullivan nodded. I see it. Panther Company, at least 5 vehicles. He raised the radio handset. All units, Vengeance Actual, enemy armor, approaching grid reference Baker 6, implement, Plan Charlie, acknowledge. The radio crackled with confirmations as the M36 units prepared to execute the carefully choreographed defensive plan they had developed and rehearsed. Sullivan's tactical doctrine had evolved significantly since their first trials at Aberdeen, refined by actual combat experience against German armor. Harrington started the engine without being told, the vehicle's systems already warmed despite the freezing temperatures. Martinez and Walker took their positions, moving with the practiced efficiency that came from weeks of combat operations. Remember, Sullivan reminded his crew, we engage from maximum effective range, no heroics. We hit them before they can hit us. The M36 moved smoothly into its designated firing position, concealed behind the remains of a stone farmhouse that provided excellent cover while allowing the 90mm gun a clear field of fire. Around them, the other tank destroyers of the battalion were similarly positioning themselves in a dispersed defensive formation designed to create overlapping fields of fire. Sullivan watched as the German Panthers emerged from the forest edge, advancing in a textbook wedge formation. Their confidence was evident in their direct approach, commanders likely expecting to encounter only the standard Shermans they had decimated so effectively in previous engagements. Range to lead vehicle? Sullivan asked. On 400 yards in closing, Thomas replied, already making firing calculations. Sullivan waited. Patience was a crucial element of their tactical doctrine. The temptation to open fire immediately was strong, but premature engagement would alert the enemy to their positions and capabilities. All units hold fire until my command, Sullivan ordered over the radio. Target distribution as assigned. Confirmed targets. The radio acknowledged with professional brevity as each M36 commander confirmed their designated target. Sullivan had developed a fire distribution system that ensured no target would receive multiple hits, while others remained unengaged. The Panthers continued their advance, now 1,200 yards distant, close enough for their 75mm guns to be dangerous to a Sherman, but still at the outer edge of effective range. For the M36, however, this was well within their lethal envelope. All units, Sullivan ordered calmly, fire. The forest erupted with the thunderous reports of multiple 90mm guns firing in sequence rather than simultaneously, another tactical refinement that prevented the enemy from immediately identifying all firing positions. Through his field glasses, Sullivan watched as armor-piercing rounds struck the advancing Panthers. Two were hit directly in their turret faces, the 90mm shells punching through even at this range. A third took a round through its drive sprocket, immobilizing it instantly. The remaining two Panthers immediately began evasive maneuvers, their commanders clearly shocked by the effectiveness of fire from beyond their own engagement range. "Vengeance units, relocate according to plan," Sullivan ordered. The M36 doctrine called for immediate position change after firing, denying the enemy the opportunity for accurate counter-battery fire. Harrington was already reversing their vehicle, backing rapidly away from the stone farmhouse just as German artillery began to target their previous position. The practice movement took them to their secondary firing position, oriented to engage any German armor attempting to flank the American lines. The surviving Panthers had split up, one attempting to circle around the American left flank while the other provided covering fire. It was a standard German tactic that Sullivan had anticipated. "Raven 3, enemy armor approaching your sector." Sullivan alerted the M36 position to counter exactly this maneuver. "Roger, Vengeance actual, target acquired." Moments later, the distinctive sound of another 90mm firing echoed across the battlefield. The flanking Panther, caught in an unexpected engagement, erupted in flames as a tungsten core HVAP round penetrated its thinner side armor. The last Panther, now recognizing the trap it had entered, began a tactical withdrawal toward the safety of the forest. Sullivan considered ordering pursuit but decided against it. Their mission was defensive, protecting the infantry positions behind them. Besides, they had achieved a remarkable victory, 4 Panthers destroyed for 0 losses. "All units, maintain positions and remain alert," Sullivan ordered. "They'll be back, likely with infantry support next time." As the echoes of combat faded, replaced by the eerie silence of the snow-covered forest, Sullivan permitted himself a moment of satisfaction. The M36 had proven itself in yet another engagement, validating the tactical doctrine they had developed. German armor superiority was being systematically neutralized by American adaptation and innovation. His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a jeep carrying Major Richard Porter, Whitmore's observer, who had been attached to Sullivan's battalion since their arrival in Europe. Despite weeks of witnessing the M36's effectiveness, Porter remained skeptical, finding fault with minor technical issues while ignoring the vehicle's overall combat success. "Impressive performance, Sullivan," Porter acknowledged grudgingly as he approached the M36. "Though I notice your gunners used a disproportionate number of HVAP rounds. Tungsten supplies remain critical." Sullivan suppressed his irritation. "Standard APC rounds are effective against Panther side armor and turret faces. We reserve HVAP for frontal engagements where nothing else will penetrate." Porter made a note in his ever-present notebook. "Nevertheless, your ammunition expenditure rates are concerning from a logistical perspective. General Whitmore will want a full accounting." "Of course," Sullivan replied evenly. "I'm sure he'll be equally interested in our kill ratios. 23 German armored vehicles destroyed in the past week alone, with only 2 M36s lost to enemy action." Porter's expression soured slightly. He couldn't dispute the numbers, which were remarkable by any standard. "Your after-action report will be expected by 0800 tomorrow. The general specifically wants details on mechanical reliability in these cold conditions." After Porter departed, Harrington emerged from the driver's hatch, watching the jeep disappear down the forest road. That man wouldn't recognize success if it bit him on the ass. Sullivan smiled slightly. He recognizes it. That's what bothers him. The M36 is succeeding despite his and Whitmore's predictions. Harrington shook his head. "Politics, even in a war zone." "Especially in a war zone," Sullivan corrected. "But it doesn't matter. What matters is that we're making a difference. German armor isn't invincible anymore." As if to emphasize his point, a column of infantry trudged past their position, soldiers offering weary salutes or thumbs-up gestures to the tank destroyer crew. Word had spread quickly among the ground troops. Where the M36s were deployed, German tanks were stopped. For men who had lived in terror of Panther and Tiger attacks, that knowledge was worth more than any official commendation. Sullivan returned their salutes, feeling the weight of their trust. These men depended on the M36 to keep the German armor at bay. Each successful engagement meant more American soldiers returning home after the war. Sons, husbands, fathers, who might otherwise have perished beneath the treads of superior German tanks. As evening approached, Sullivan gathered his battalion commanders for a briefing in a partially destroyed farmhouse that served as their temporary headquarters. Maps were spread across a makeshift table, illuminated by battery-powered lamps. Intelligence reports indicate increased German armor movements in sectors Charlie and Dog, Sullivan explained, pointing to areas on the map. They're likely planning a major push to break through our lines within the next 48 hours. Captain Lewis, commanding the battalion's 2nd Company, studied the map with concern. We're stretched thin, Major. 16 M36s to cover a 5-mile front, which is why we'll be receiving reinforcements tomorrow, Sullivan revealed. 10 more M36s are en route from the assembly point at Liège. They'll bolster our center and right flank positions. The news was met with approving nods. More M36s meant greater defensive capability against the expected German assault. What about ammunition? Lieutenant Parker asked. Especially HVAP rounds. Supply convoy arriving tonight, Sullivan assured him, including 200 HVAP rounds allocated specifically for our battalion. The briefing continued with assignment of sectors, communication protocols, and contingency plans. Sullivan had developed a comprehensive defensive strategy based on the M36's strengths, superior range, mobility, and the devastating power of the 90mm gun. As the meeting concluded, Captain Lewis remained behind. Permission to speak freely, sir? Of course, James. Lewis had been among the first officers Sullivan had trained on the M36, a former Sherman commander who had survived 3 tanks being shot out from under him. His experience made his insights particularly valuable. The men are talking, Lewis began. Word is that General Eisenhower himself has taken notice of our success against German armor. There's rumor of commendations. Sullivan shrugged. Rumors are just that. What matters is performance in the field. There's more, Lewis continued. Intelligence intercepted German communications referring specifically to the M36. They're calling it Panzerschreck, tank terror. Their crews are being warned to avoid engagement unless they have overwhelming numerical superiority. Sullivan couldn't suppress a smile at this. German acknowledgement of the M36's effectiveness was perhaps the most meaningful validation they could receive. Keep that to yourself for now, Sullivan advised. We don't want overconfidence. The Germans are adapting their tactics just as we are. Lewis nodded in agreement. One more thing, sir. The men have started calling themselves cat killers, unofficial unit nickname after all the Panthers and Tigers we've knocked out. Cat killers, Sullivan repeated thoughtfully. Appropriate, if unofficial. After Lewis departed, Sullivan returned to his quarters, a corner of the farmhouse sectioned off with canvas for minimal privacy. Despite his exhaustion, he spent an hour writing in his tactical journal, documenting the day's engagement and refining his combat doctrine based on observed results. The M36 was proving even more effective in combat than their tests had suggested. The 90mm gun consistently penetrated Panther and Tiger armor at ranges that kept the tank destroyers outside effective German return fire. The open turret, initially considered a vulnerability, had proven advantageous in actual combat, allowing better visibility and communication between crew members. Sullivan was making final notes when a messenger arrived with a priority communication from division headquarters. He broke the seal and read the contents with growing concern. German forces had launched a major offensive along a 50-mile front. The largest armored formation since the Battle of Kursk was heading directly for the American positions. Intelligence estimated over 300 German tanks and assault guns, including at least 60 Tigers, would reach Sullivan's sector within 24 hours. The message concluded with a simple directive. Hold at all costs. Reinforcements en route but delayed. Expect arrival not sooner than 48 hours. Sullivan read the message twice, understanding its implications. His 16 M36 plus the 10 reinforcements expected tomorrow would be facing the spearhead of a massive German armored thrust. They would be outnumbered at least 4-1, possibly worse. Sleep was now impossible. Sullivan returned to his maps, analyzing terrain features, identifying potential ambush positions, calculating ammunition requirements. They couldn't stop such a large force conventionally, but they might be able to channel it, delay it, reduce it. By dawn, he had developed a new defensive strategy. Rather than attempting to hold a continuous line, the M36s would operate in mobile hunter-killer teams, striking from prepared positions and then relocating immediately. Maximum use of terrain features, coordinated fire plans, and careful conservation of HVAP rounds for the heaviest German tanks. As first light broke over the snow-covered Ardennes, Sullivan gathered his officers and NCOs. Their faces showed the strain of continuous combat operations, but also determination and growing confidence in their unique capabilities. "Gentlemen," Sullivan began, "we face our greatest challenge yet. But remember this. 6 weeks ago, American armor was at a severe disadvantage against German Panthers and Tigers. Today, we've changed that equation. The M36 has proven it can destroy any German tank at ranges beyond their effective reach." He outlined the new defensive strategy, emphasizing mobility, coordination, and intelligence sharing between units. Each officer and NCO asked relevant questions, suggested refinements based on their combat experience, and ultimately expressed confidence in the plan. As they dispersed to prepare their units, Sullivan felt both the weight of responsibility and the strength of leadership. These men trusted him. More importantly, they believed in the M36 and the tactical doctrine they had developed together. The reinforcement column arrived shortly before noon. 10 factory-fresh M36s with crews trained according to Sullivan's developing doctrine. The new vehicles were immediately integrated into the defensive plan, their commanders briefed on the imminent German offensive. By mid-afternoon, the distant rumble of heavy engines could be heard echoing through the forest. German armor was approaching. Sullivan took his position in the command M36, designated Vengeance Actual, positioned where he could observe the most likely avenue of German advance. "All units, final communications check," he ordered over the radio. Each M36 team reported ready, positioned according to the defensive plan. Sullivan could visualize them spread across the landscape, concealed in prepared positions with pre-ranged firing lanes. "Remember your training," he reminded them. "Engage at maximum effective range. One shot, one kill. Relocate immediately after firing. Conserve HVAP rounds for Tigers and Panther frontal engagements." The rumbling grew louder. Through his field glasses, Sullivan observed the first German vehicles emerging from the forest. Panthers in the lead, followed by the heavier Tigers, with Panzer IVs and assault guns providing support. Behind them came armored personnel carriers filled with infantry. Sullivan felt his heart rate increase but kept his voice steady. "All units hold fire. Let them advance into the kill zone." The German formation continued forward, commanders evidently confident in their numerical superiority. They advanced in textbook formation, maintaining proper intervals, presenting a formidable armored front. When the lead vehicles reached the predetermined range markers, Sullivan gave the order, "All units, execute fire plan Alpha." Across the battlefield, M36 guns spoke in disciplined sequence. Sullivan watched as 5 German tanks were hit almost simultaneously, precision fire striking vulnerable points identified during weeks of combat analysis. The German formation faltered momentarily as commanders assessed this unexpected long-range threat. Then, with typical professional discipline, they began deploying to battle formation, seeking to bring their guns to bear on the American positions. "All units relocate according to plan," Sullivan ordered, and Harrington immediately reversed their M36 from its concealed position, moving rapidly to their secondary firing location as German shells began impacting their previous position. The elaborate defensive choreography Sullivan had designed now unfolded across the battlefield. M36 teams fired, relocated, and re-engaged from new positions, creating the impression of a much larger defending force. German armor, unable to effectively return fire at such ranges, suffered mounting casualties while achieving minimal success against the elusive American tank destroyers. By late afternoon, the pattern was clear. The German advance had been slowed significantly, with over 30 armored vehicles destroyed or disabled. But Sullivan knew this was merely the first wave. Intelligence had proven accurate about the size of the German force, and fresh formations were continuously arriving at the battlefield. "Ammunition report," he requested over the command channel. The responses confirmed his concern. Despite careful conservation, HVAP rounds were running dangerously low across the battalion. Standard armor-piercing ammunition remained plentiful, but without the tungsten core rounds, engaging Tigers frontally would become significantly more difficult. As darkness approached, the German advance slowed, their commanders apparently deciding to regroup and continue at first light. Sullivan used the opportunity to rotate crews, allowing minimal rest periods while maintaining combat readiness. In his command vehicle, Sullivan consulted with his executive officer, Captain Donovan. "We've done well today, at least 35 German armored vehicles confirmed destroyed, but they have only committed about 20% of their available force. Donovan nodded grimly. And our reinforcements are still at least 24 hours away. We need to adjust our tactics for tomorrow, Sullivan decided. More emphasis on flank shots, less direct engagement. We'll need to use the terrain more effectively, draw them into choke points where their numerical advantage is minimized. As they refined their defensive plan, a messenger arrived with an update from division headquarters. The news was both encouraging and concerning. Reinforcements were indeed en route, but the German offensive was larger than initially estimated. Sullivan's M36 battalion was defending what intelligence now identified as a crucial sector for the entire Allied position. The message concluded with a personal note from the division commander. Your stand against superior enemy forces has not gone unnoticed. Hold for 24 more hours. Help is coming. Sullivan shared this information with his officers, emphasizing the strategic importance of their position while acknowledging the challenges they faced. The men received the news with the professional composure he had come to expect, focusing on practical considerations rather than the daunting odds against them. As midnight approached, Sullivan finally allowed himself a brief rest period, knowing tomorrow would demand every ounce of his mental and physical resources. Lying on his cot in the command post, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. From the testing grounds at Aberdeen to the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes, the M36 had evolved from concept to combat-proven weapon. His crew had grown from skeptical strangers to a perfectly synchronized team. His tactical doctrine had been refined through actual combat experience into a sophisticated approach that maximized American strengths while exploiting German vulnerabilities. Tomorrow would bring their greatest test yet, but as Sullivan drifted into much-needed sleep, he felt a profound certainty that they had already succeeded in their fundamental mission. The M36 had changed the equation on the battlefield. American tankers no longer faced German armor with inadequate weapons. The hunter had become the hunted. The big cats had met their match. Chapter 9, Breaking Point. The German attack resumed at dawn, preceded by a massive artillery barrage that transformed the peaceful snow-covered landscape into a churned wasteland of craters and shattered trees. Major James Sullivan, operating on less than 3 hours of sleep, coordinated his battalion's response from the command M36, designating firing zones and target priorities as the German armor advanced in force. All units, maintain discipline, he reminded his commanders. Engage at maximum effective range. Make every shot count. The previous day's success had proven the effectiveness of Sullivan's tactics. The M36's 90mm gun, coupled with their mobile ambush doctrine, allowed American forces to engage German armor from beyond effective return fire range. But ammunition constraints and the sheer numerical superiority of the German force created a precarious situation. Panther Company advancing on Sector Charlie, reported Captain Lewis over the radio. Request permission to engage. Granted, Sullivan confirmed. Remember, standard AP for flanking shots. Save HVAP for frontal engagements with heavy armor. Throughout the morning, the pattern of combat established itself. German armor would advance. M36 teams would engage from concealed positions, then relocate before German artillery could target them effectively. It was a deadly dance of firepower and mobility, with the Americans exploiting their superior gunnery while the Germans relied on overwhelming numbers. By midday, Sullivan's battalion had accounted for another 20 German armored vehicles destroyed or disabled, but the pressure was mounting. 3 M36s had been lost to enemy action, their crews forced to abandon their vehicles under fire. Ammunition reserves were reaching critical levels, particularly the vital HVAP rounds. Sir, Harrington called from the driver's position, fuel gauge showing quarter tank. We've been maneuvering continuously since dawn. Sullivan acknowledged the information with concern. Fuel consumption had increased dramatically due to the constant repositioning required by their tactics. Another constraint to manage in an already complex situation. All units, he broadcast, implement fuel conservation measures, minimize unnecessary movement, maintain tactical effectiveness. The afternoon brought a brief respite as the German advance paused, likely to regroup and reorganize after the substantial losses inflicted by the M36 battalion. Sullivan used this opportunity to consolidate his forces, redistributing ammunition and establishing new defensive positions. During this lull, Major Porter arrived in his jeep, clipboard in hand as always. Despite the combat conditions, his uniform remained impeccably pressed, creating a stark contrast with the exhausted, grimy appearance of the fighting men. Major Sullivan, Porter greeted him with formal correctness. I'm conducting an assessment of the M36's performance under sustained combat operations. Sullivan suppressed his irritation. Even now, with a major battle unfolding around them, Whitmore's representative remained focused on finding flaws in the M36 program. As you can see, Major, we're somewhat occupied at the moment, Sullivan replied. But the results speak for themselves. 55 confirmed enemy armor kills in the past 36 hours. Porter made a note on his clipboard. Yes, impressive numbers. However, I've observed concerning mechanical issues, transmission overheating, excessive track wear, cooling system limitations under continuous operation. Before Sullivan could respond, the radio crackled with an urgent message. Vengeance Actual, this is Outpost 7. Large enemy formation approaching from the northeast. Multiple Tiger tanks identified. Sullivan immediately refocused on the tactical situation. Excuse me, Major Porter, duty calls. Returning to his command vehicle, Sullivan quickly assessed the developing threat. A fresh German armored formation, including the dreaded Tiger tanks, was attempting to exploit a perceived weakness in the American right flank. All available units with HVAP ammunition, reposition to Sector Delta, Sullivan ordered. Prepare for heavy armor engagement. As his driver maneuvered their M36 toward the threatened sector, Sullivan calculated the odds they faced. His battalion was down to 23 operational vehicles. Ammunition and fuel were running low. The promised reinforcements were still hours away. Against this, the Germans were committing what appeared to be their reserve force, including at least 8 Tiger tanks, the most formidable armored fighting vehicles on the European battlefield. Under normal circumstances, such a force would slice through American defenses with minimal resistance. But these were not normal circumstances. The M36 had changed the equation. Its 90mm gun could defeat even Tiger armor at combat ranges, provided the crews maintained their discipline and tactical positioning. Sullivan's command vehicle reached an elevated position overlooking the approaching German formation. Through his field glasses, he confirmed the intelligence report. 8 Tigers, supported by numerous Panthers and lighter vehicles. All units in Sector Delta report HVAP ammunition status, Sullivan requested over the radio. The responses were concerning. Among the 7 M36s now positioned to meet this threat, they had a total of 12 HVAP rounds remaining, not enough to engage all the Tigers frontally. Sullivan made a rapid tactical assessment. We need to separate the Tigers from their support elements, he told his crew. Force them to advance through the ravine where they can't maintain formation. Using the terrain to their advantage had been a cornerstone of Sullivan's doctrine. The narrow ravine would force the German armor to proceed in column rather than line abreast, allowing the M36s to engage individual vehicles sequentially rather than simultaneously. All Sector Delta units, Sullivan ordered, implement Fire Plan Echo. I repeat, Fire Plan Echo. The carefully rehearsed plan called for specific M36s to target the lead and rear vehicles in the German column, immobilizing them and trapping the remainder in the ravine with limited maneuverability. The remaining M36s would then engage the trapped vehicles from elevated positions on the ravine's edges. As the German formation approached the ravine entrance, Sullivan gave the executive order. Echo units, engage. 2 M36s fired simultaneously, their 90mm rounds striking the lead Tiger's track assembly in the trailing Panther's engine compartment. Both vehicles were immobilized instantly, creating a blockage at both ends of the narrow passage. The remaining German tanks, now confined in the ravine, began traversing their turrets, searching for targets. All units, engage at will, Sullivan ordered. Prioritize flank shots where possible. The ravine erupted with the thunder of multiple 90mm guns firing from concealed positions on the high ground. German armor, caught in the carefully planned ambush, suffered devastating hits from angles their heaviest frontal armor couldn't protect. Sullivan observed the engagement through his field glasses, directing fire adjustment when necessary. Target Tiger at grid reference Delta 4. Use HVAP. Thomas, who had been with Sullivan since the beginning, made the necessary calculations. On target. Fire. The 90mm gun roared, its muzzle blast kicking up a cloud of snow and debris. Through his glasses, Sullivan watched the tungsten core round strike the Tiger precisely at the turret ring, one of the few vulnerable points in its otherwise impenetrable frontal armor. The German tank shuddered to a halt, smoke pouring from its hatches as the crew abandoned the stricken vehicle. For 20 minutes, the one-sided engagement continued. German armor, trapped in the ravine with limited ability to maneuver or effectively return fire, was systematically destroyed by the M36's firing from advantageous positions. By the time the last operational German tank retreated from the ravine, the engagement had resulted in the destruction of 6 Tigers and 11 other armored vehicles. As Sullivan's crews regrouped and assessed their status, a new threat emerged. German infantry, advancing under covering fire from self-propelled guns, was attempting to flank the American positions on foot. The M36, while devastatingly effective against armor, was vulnerable to infantry assault due to its open turret. All units, fall back to secondary positions, Sullivan ordered. Implement infantry defense protocol. The M36 battalion executed a fighting withdrawal, maintaining their cohesion while repositioning to more defensible terrain. Sullivan had anticipated this German tactic and prepared accordingly. The secondary positions included interlocking fields of fire and close support from American infantry units that had been attached to the battalion for precisely this purpose. As the engagement evolved into a combined arms battle, Sullivan coordinated with infantry commanders to establish a mutually supporting defense. The M36s provided heavy firepower against German vehicles and crew-served weapons, while the infantry protected the tank destroyers from enemy foot soldiers. By late afternoon, the German attack had stalled completely. The losses inflicted by Sullivan's battalion had depleted the enemy's armored strength beyond sustainable levels. Intelligence reports indicated the German forces were now digging defensive positions rather than preparing for further offensive operations. Sullivan used this opportunity to consolidate his remaining assets. The battalion was down to 19 operational M36s, with critically low levels of ammunition and fuel. But they had accomplished their mission, holding against overwhelming odds until reinforcements could arrive. As twilight approached, Sullivan received the news he had been waiting for. American reinforcements were less than 2 hours away, including fresh M36 units and substantial infantry support. They had succeeded in buying the critical time needed. In his command vehicle, Sullivan finally allowed himself to acknowledge the exhaustion that had been building over the past 2 days of continuous combat. His crew was similarly drained, their faces showing the strain of prolonged battle. "You should rest, sir," Harrington suggested from the driver's position. "We'll maintain watch." Sullivan nodded gratefully. 30 minutes, then wake me for a status update." He had barely closed his eyes when the radio crackled with an urgent message. "Vengeance Actual. This is Outpost 3, emergency transmission. German armor breakthrough in Sector Alpha. Multiple vehicles advancing rapidly toward command post." Sullivan was immediately alert. Details, numbers, and types. 3 Panthers and supporting infantry. They've broken through the line where Baker Company was positioned. Sullivan quickly assessed the situation. A small German force had apparently identified a weakness in the American defenses and was attempting to exploit it with a rapid thrust toward the battalion headquarters. If successful, they could disrupt the entire defensive network Sullivan had established. "Alert all available units," Sullivan ordered. "Intercept force approaching from Sector Alpha." But as reports came in, it became clear that the M36s were too widely dispersed to respond in time. Most were low on fuel. Some completely immobilized after the day's operations. The German thrust, while small, had been perfectly timed to exploit these limitations. Sullivan made a rapid decision. "Harrington, get us to checkpoint 7. That position overlooks the approach route they'll have to take." "Sir, we have only 2 rounds remaining," Martinez reminded him. 1 standard AP and 1 HVAP. "Then we'll make them count," Sullivan replied grimly. Harrington engaged the transmission, and the M36 moved rapidly toward the designated position, its engine straining after hours of continuous operation. They reached the checkpoint with minutes to spare, positioning the vehicle behind a low stone wall that provided some cover while allowing the 90mm gun a clear field of fire. "There they are," Thomas announced, spotting movement through his gunner's sight. 3 Panthers, just as reported, ranged 900 yards and closing. Sullivan studied the approaching German tanks. They were advancing in a wedge formation, maintaining proper intervals, commanders visible in their turret hatches as they directed their advance with professional confidence. "Wait until they reach the crossroads," Sullivan instructed. "We'll engage the lead vehicle first, then the trailing one to block their retreat." The Panthers continued their advance, evidently unaware of the M36 positioned ahead of them. When they reached the designated engagement point, Sullivan gave the order. "Target lead Panther, standard AP round, fire." Thomas fired with the precision that had made him the battalion's premier gunner. The 90mm shell struck the Panther's turret at an oblique angle, penetrating the armor and apparently disabling its gun mechanism. The German tank slewed to a halt, smoke pouring from its hatches. The remaining two Panthers immediately began evasive maneuvers, one veering left while the other reversed direction. Sullivan had anticipated this reaction. Target the reversing Panther, HVAP round, fire. Again, Thomas demonstrated his exceptional skill, placing the tungsten core round precisely at the junction of the Panther's hull and turret. The German tank shuddered violently as the round penetrated, then erupted in flames as its ammunition detonated. The third Panther, now aware of the deadly threat, traversed its turret toward the M36's position and fired. The German shell struck the stone wall in front of Sullivan's vehicle, showering them with stone fragments, but causing no serious damage. "We're out of ammunition," Martinez reported tensely. "No more rounds for the main gun." Sullivan knew they were now in a precarious position. The remaining Panther outgunned them significantly, and without ammunition, their primary weapon was useless. But retreating would leave the headquarters area vulnerable. "Harrington, prepare to execute Maneuver 17 on my command," Sullivan ordered, referring to an evasive driving pattern they had developed specifically for close quarters engagement. Before they could implement this desperate measure, a thunderous explosion rocked the battlefield. Through his field glasses, Sullivan observed the remaining Panther erupting in flames, its turret blown completely off. Behind it, emerging from the forest edge, came the unmistakable profile of an M36 tank destroyer. "Vengeance Actual, this is Thunderbolt 6, came a voice over the radio. "Looks like you could use some assistance." Sullivan felt a wave of relief. "Thunderbolt 6, your timing is impeccable. Welcome to the party." The arriving vehicle was the vanguard of the long-awaited reinforcement column. Fresh M36 units, fully supplied with ammunition and fuel, were finally reaching the battlefield after forced marches from reserve positions. As Sullivan directed the integration of these reinforcements into his defensive network, he received a priority message from division headquarters. The German offensive had been blunted across the entire front, largely due to the stand made by Sullivan's M36 battalion. What had been planned as a major armored thrust to split the American lines had instead resulted in the loss of over 80 German tanks and assault guns, with minimal territorial gains. The message concluded with a personal note from the division commander. "Your battalion's performance has exceeded all expectations. The M36 has proven its worth beyond question." "Well done, Major Sullivan." As night fell over the Ardennes, Sullivan gathered his officers for a briefing in the battalion headquarters. The mood was one of exhausted satisfaction. Against overwhelming odds, they had held their ground and inflicted devastating losses on elite German armored units. "Gentlemen," Sullivan addressed them, his voice hoarse from 2 days of continuous command operations, "what you've accomplished here will be studied in military academies for years to come. You've proven that American innovation and adaptability can overcome even the most formidable enemy advantages." Captain Lewis, whose company had borne the brunt of the initial German assault, raised a pertinent question. "What about Major Porter's assessment, sir? Will General Whitmore acknowledge the M36's success?" Sullivan smiled slightly. Interestingly, Major Porter departed rather hastily when that last German breakthrough threatened the command post. But before he left, he mentioned that his report would reflect the observed combat effectiveness of the M36 platform. This elicited knowing chuckles from the assembled officers. Even Porter, Whitmore's dedicated critic, couldn't ignore the overwhelming evidence of the M36's battlefield success. "Rest while you can," Sullivan concluded. "Tomorrow brings new challenges. But tonight, know that you've changed the course of this battle, perhaps of the entire campaign. The M36 has proven itself where it matters most, on the battlefield." As the meeting disbanded, Sullivan returned to his quarters, a corner of the command bunker partitioned for his use. He was retrieving his tactical journal when he noticed a telegram that had arrived with the latest communications packet. The message was brief but momentous. Based on the M36's combat performance, the War Department had authorized maximum production priority. Factories across America were transitioning to full-scale M36 manufacturing, with projected delivery of 500 units within the next 60 days. Sullivan sat heavily on his cot, the telegram still in his hand. From concept to prototype to combat-proven weapon, the M36 had completed a remarkable journey. What had begun as a stopgap solution had evolved into a vital component of American armored warfare. As exhaustion finally overcame him, Sullivan's last thoughts were not of tactical doctrine or production schedules, but of the men who had made this success possible. His original crew, who had believed in the M36's potential from the beginning. The battalion commanders who had implemented and refined his tactical innovations. The factory workers back home who had transformed engineering drawings into battlefield reality. And somewhere, he hoped, Frank Miller was looking down with approval. The friend whose loss had inspired Sullivan's determination to give American tankers a fighting chance against German armor. That mission, at least, had been accomplished. The hunter had become the hunted. The big cats had met their match. The February sun hung low in the gray German sky, offering little warmth to the advancing American forces. Lieutenant Colonel James Sullivan, recently promoted following his battalion's success in the Ardennes, stood atop a small ridge overlooking the winding Rhine River. Through his field glasses, he studied the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, the last remaining span across the Rhine, and potentially the key to a swift Allied advance into the German heartland. Intelligence reports indicated the Germans were preparing to demolish the bridge, as they had all others along the Rhine. Sullivan's enhanced M36 battalion, now 30 vehicles strong, had been specifically tasked with securing the approach to Remagen and preventing enemy armor from interfering with the Allied push to capture the bridge intact. "Beautiful piece of engineering," Harrington commented, standing beside Sullivan and studying the distant bridge. In the months since Aberdeen, the sergeant had become more than just Sullivan's driver. He was a trusted advisor, his practical experience complementing Sullivan's tactical knowledge. "And our ticket into Germany, if we can capture it before they blow it," Sullivan replied. He lowered his glasses and turned to face the officers gathered around him. "Gentlemen, our mission is clear. We establish blocking positions along these 3 approach routes." He indicated points on the map spread before them. "Intelligence confirms German armor in the vicinity, likely with orders to delay our advance until demolition preparations are complete." Captain Lewis studied the map intently. "Tiger Battalion reported near Cologne, moving this direction. If they reach the bridge before we secure it," Sullivan nodded grimly. "Exactly, which is why we deploy immediately. Captain Reynolds, your company takes the northern approach. Lewis, you cover the central road. Martinez, your company secures the southern flank." Corporal Martinez, now Captain Martinez following a battlefield commission, acknowledged the order with professional confidence. His elevation to company commander reflected Sullivan's philosophy of promoting exceptional talent regardless of conventional career paths. "What about air support, sir?" Reynolds asked. "Ninth Air Force has promised P-47s for close support if weather permits," Sullivan replied. "But given these conditions, we plan as if we're on our own." Questions? There were none. These officers had been with Sullivan through the crucible of combat. They understood his tactical doctrine and the capabilities of their M36 tank destroyers. More importantly, they believed in both. "We move in 30 minutes, Sullivan concluded. "Notify your platoon leaders." As the officers dispersed to prepare their units, Thomas approached Sullivan. The former gunner now served as Sullivan's operations officer, his natural tactical instinct having proven invaluable during planning. "The terrain favors us," Thomas observed, gesturing toward the rolling hills surrounding Remagen. "Good hull-down positions with clear fields of fire," Sullivan agreed. "Perfect for our doctrine. If German armor approaches, we engage at maximum range, then relocate to alternate positions." The distinctive sound of approaching aircraft interrupted their conversation. Looking skyward, Sullivan spotted the angular silhouettes of P-47 Thunderbolts, their presence a welcome surprise given the marginal weather conditions. "Looks like the Air Force came through after all," Thomas remarked. "Good. We'll need every advantage." Sullivan checked his watch. Time to move out. Within the hour, Sullivan's battalion had deployed according to plan, establishing overlapping fields of fire covering all approaches to Remagen. From his command position, Sullivan maintained radio contact with all 3 companies, coordinating their defensive preparations while receiving regular intelligence updates from division headquarters. "Vengeance Actual, this is Eagle 6, came a transmission from the Air Force liaison officer. "Reconnaissance reports enemy armor moving toward your position from the northeast. Estimated 1 company strength, including heavy tanks." Sullivan acknowledged the information and immediately adjusted his defensive posture, shifting additional M36s to reinforce the northeastern approach. The tactical flexibility he had emphasized throughout their training now paid dividends as units relocated smoothly to meet the emerging threat. "All units, maintain radio discipline," Sullivan ordered. "Report enemy sightings immediately but keep transmissions brief." The afternoon passed with increasing tension, but no enemy contact. Intelligence continued to report German armored movements in the vicinity, but the expected assault had not materialized. Sullivan suspected the enemy commanders were consolidating their forces for a coordinated attack, likely timed to coincide with the final demolition preparations at the bridge. As evening approached, Sullivan received an urgent transmission from division headquarters. Vengeance Actual, this is Overlord. Be advised, latest intelligence indicates demolition charges are being placed on Remagen Bridge. Timeline for detonation estimated 12 to 18 hours. Your mission priority is updated. Delay any enemy armor attempting to reach the bridge. 9th Armored Division elements are en route to attempt bridge seizure. ETA 0700 tomorrow. The implications were clear. Sullivan's M36 battalion would play a critical role in the attempt to capture the last intact bridge across the Rhine. If they could prevent German armor from reinforcing the bridge defense, the 9th Armored might have a chance to seize it before demolition. Sullivan immediately gathered his company commanders for an updated briefing. The situation has changed. Our defensive mission now has direct impact on the potential capture of Remagen Bridge. Intelligence confirms demolition charges are being placed. 9th Armored is moving to seize the bridge, but won't arrive until morning. Our job is to ensure no German armor interferes with that operation. The officers absorbed this information with professional focus. Each understood the strategic importance of capturing an intact bridge across the Rhine. Such an opportunity might not come again. Sir, Captain Lewis asked, what if the German armor doesn't come to us? What if they're positioning to defend the bridge itself? Good question, Sullivan acknowledged. If we don't detect enemy armor movement by 2300 hours, we'll send reconnaissance elements forward to determine their positions. We can't allow them to establish defensive positions overlooking the bridge approach. As night fell, Sullivan maintained his vigilance, rotating crews to ensure constant readiness while allowing minimal rest periods. The stakes were too high for complacency. Somewhere in the darkness, German armor was maneuvering, and Sullivan was determined to be prepared when it appeared. Shortly after midnight, the radio crackled with an urgent transmission. Vengeance Actual, this is Phantom 3. Enemy armor detected moving along Route Green. Multiple heavy tanks, estimated Tiger models, plus supporting vehicles. Sullivan immediately ordered illumination rounds from supporting artillery. As the magnesium flares burst overhead, bathing the landscape in harsh white light, the advancing German formation was revealed. 8 Tiger tanks, accompanied by several lighter vehicles, moving with deliberate purpose toward Remagen. All units, implement Fire Plan Delta, Sullivan ordered calmly. The carefully rehearsed plan called for sequential engagement from multiple firing positions, creating the impression of a much larger defending force. The night erupted with the thunderous reports of 90mm guns firing in disciplined sequence. Through his field glasses, Sullivan observed 3 German tanks hit almost simultaneously, the armor-piercing rounds finding their marks despite the challenging night conditions. The German formation halted, commanders obviously reassessing in light of this unexpected resistance. Then, with professional discipline, they began deploying to battle formation, seeking the source of the American fire. All units relocate according to plan, Sullivan ordered. The M36s immediately withdrew from their firing positions, moving rapidly to alternate locations as German return fire struck their previous positions. For the next 2 hours, a deadly game of cat and mouse unfolded across the darkened landscape. Sullivan's M36s would engage from concealed positions, inflict damage on the German armor, then relocate before effective return fire could be brought to bear. The German advance slowed to a crawl, commanders understandably cautious in the face of an enemy they could target only by muzzle flashes. By 300 hours, the German attack had stalled completely. 4 Tiger tanks and several support vehicles lay burning or disabled, while the remaining forces had withdrawn to defensive positions. Sullivan's battalion had suffered only light casualties, 1 M36 destroyed and 2 damaged but repairable. They'll try again at first light, Sullivan predicted during a brief conference with his company commanders. Probably with air support if weather permits. We need to adjust our positions accordingly. Throughout the remaining hours of darkness, Sullivan's battalion executed a carefully planned repositioning. By dawn, they had established new defensive positions with enhanced camouflage and prepared alternate firing locations. The M36s were now arrayed in greater depth, creating defense in depth rather than a linear barrier. As the first gray light of morning revealed the battlefield, Sullivan received confirmation that elements of the 9th Armored Division were approaching Remagen from the west. The race for the bridge was entering its critical phase. All units remain alert, Sullivan broadcast. Enemy armor will likely make another attempt to reach the bridge. Our mission is to prevent that at all costs. The predicted German attack began shortly after U-700 hours, this time from multiple directions simultaneously. Panther tanks led the assault, advancing in bounds while Tiger tanks provided covering fire from hull-down positions. It was a textbook armored attack and executed with the skill that had made German panzer forces legendary. Sullivan's battalion responded with equal professionalism. The M36s engaged the advancing Panthers at maximum effective range, their 90mm guns demonstrating once again the ability to penetrate German armor at distances the enemy could not match. The carefully planned defensive positions that allowed Sullivan's forces to engage, relocate, and re-engage continuously, presenting the Germans with an elusive target while maintaining constant pressure. By mid-morning, the German attack had been blunted on all approaches. Through his field glasses, Sullivan observed enemy vehicles withdrawing beyond effective range, apparently regrouping for another attempt. This pause gave him the opportunity to check on the progress of the 9th Armored Division. "Overlord, this is Vengeance Actual," he transmitted. "Status on bridge seizure operation?" The response was encouraging. "Vengeance Actual, 9th Armored Elements have reached Remagen town. Advancing toward bridge now. German demolition team confirmed on site. Critical phase imminent." Sullivan immediately grasped the implications. The next hour would determine whether Allied forces captured the bridge intact or the Germans successfully destroyed it. His battalion's role was to ensure no German armor interfered with this crucial operation. As if on cue, a new transmission arrived from his forward observation post. "Vengeance Actual, enemy armor massing for renewed attack. Multiple heavy tanks with infantry support. They appear to be committing all remaining reserves." This was the decisive moment. Sullivan issued rapid orders, concentrating his forces to meet the main German thrust while maintaining minimal coverage on secondary approaches. If the enemy was indeed committing their reserves, this would be their final attempt to reach the bridge. "All units with HVAP ammunition, prepare for maximum range engagement," Sullivan ordered. "Priority targets are command tanks and lead elements." The German attack, when it came, was pressed with desperate intensity. Tiger and Panther tanks advanced aggressively, accepting greater risk in their determination to break through to Remagen. Sullivan recognized the change in tactics immediately. The German commanders had obviously received word of the American attempt to seize the bridge and were now racing to prevent it. "They're getting reckless," Sullivan observed to Thomas, who had joined him in the command M36, "exposing their flanks in their haste." Thomas nodded grimly. Desperation makes for poor tactical decisions. Sullivan's forces exploited this recklessness ruthlessly. M36 teams engaged the advancing German armor from multiple angles, concentrating fire on exposed flanks and vulnerable components. The 90mm guns proved devastating, particularly when firing from elevated positions that negated the German armor's frontal protection. The battle reached its climax shortly before noon. The German attack, having lost momentum and suffered severe casualties, began to falter. Sullivan, sensing the opportunity, ordered a limited counterattack, pushing forward elements of his battalion to pursue the withdrawing enemy forces. It was during this phase that Sullivan received the transmission that would be remembered in military history. "All units, this is Overlord. Remagen Bridge captured intact. Repeat, Ludendorff Bridge secured. 9th Armored establishing defensive positions on East Bank. German demolition partially failed. Bridge damaged but passable." A momentary silence fell over the command network as the significance registered. The last bridge over the Rhine, the final natural barrier before the German heartland, had been captured intact. The war's end had just accelerated significantly. "Vengeance Actual acknowledges," Sullivan replied formally, maintaining professional composure despite the momentous news. "Be advised, enemy armor in our sector is in retreat. We are pursuing to prevent reorganization." For the remainder of the day, Sullivan's battalion continued to press the retreating German forces, preventing any attempt to regroup for a counterattack against the bridge. By evening, the immediate area had been secured, and the flow of American forces across the captured span had begun in earnest. As twilight approached, Sullivan received orders to establish defensive positions east of the Rhine, protecting the vulnerable bridgehead against potential German counterattacks. His battalion, having played a crucial role in the bridge's capture, would now help ensure it remained in American hands. In his command vehicle crossing the Ludendorff Bridge into Germany proper, Sullivan felt the weight of the moment. The M36, once a controversial stopgap solution, had proven decisive in one of the war's most important operations. The vehicle that critics had dismissed as inadequate had helped open the path into the German heartland. "Never thought I'd be driving into Germany," Harrington commented from the driver's position, his weathered face showing a mixture of satisfaction and somber reflection. Sullivan nodded in agreement. "Nor I, but here we are, thanks in no small part to this machine." He patted the turret of the M36 with genuine affection. From Aberdeen to the Ardennes to Remagen, the tank destroyer had exceeded all expectations, transforming from desperate solution to battle-winning weapon. As they rolled deeper into enemy territory, Sullivan knew the war was far from over, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. The road to victory now lay open before them. Chapter 11, The Legacy Forged. The warm spring sunshine bathed the German countryside in golden light as Lieutenant Colonel James Sullivan stood before the assembled men of his battalion. 4 months had passed since the capture of the Remagen Bridge, 4 months of continuous advance into the German heartland. Now, with the war in Europe officially ended, Sullivan was addressing his command for perhaps the final time. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying across the attentive formation, "what we have accomplished together will be recorded in history books, but the full measure of your achievement may never be properly recognized. You transformed a stopgap solution into a decisive weapon. You developed tactics that negated enemy advantages and exploited their vulnerabilities. Most importantly, you saved countless American lives by preventing German armor from dominating the battlefield." Sullivan paused, looking across the faces of men who had become far more than subordinates. They were brothers forged in the crucible of combat, bound by shared purpose and mutual respect. "The official statistics tell part of the story," he continued. "This battalion destroyed 186 German armored vehicles, including 43 Tiger tanks and 71 Panthers. But numbers alone cannot convey what you accomplished. You changed the fundamental equation of armored warfare on the Western Front. You proved that American ingenuity and adaptability could overcome even the most formidable technological advantages." As Sullivan continued his address, his mind drifted briefly to the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the desperate days following Frank Miller's death in Normandy to the testing grounds at Aberdeen, from the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes to the strategic triumph at Remagen, the M36 had been there throughout, evolving from concept to combat-proven weapon under the most demanding conditions imaginable. "As we prepare to return home," Sullivan concluded, "carry with you the knowledge that what you did here mattered. The lives you saved, the victories you enabled, the innovation you embraced, these are your lasting legacy." The formation dispersed with uncharacteristic emotion. Men who had maintained professional composure under the enemy fire now openly expressing the bonds formed through shared danger and common purpose. Sullivan found himself surrounded by officers and enlisted men alike, each wanting a final word with the commander who had led them through the war's most challenging phases. Among them was Sergeant William Harrington, his weathered face showing the strain of continuous combat operations, but his eyes reflecting quiet pride. "Never thought an old man like me would make it through," he remarked with characteristic understatement. Sullivan clasped his shoulder firmly. "You did more than make it through, Bill. You helped make history." As the impromptu gathering continued, a staff car approached the assembly area. From it emerged General Palmer, now wearing the 3 stars of a lieutenant general, accompanied by several high-ranking officers. The men of Sullivan's battalion came to attention as Palmer approached. "At ease, gentlemen," Palmer instructed. "I'm not here for formality. I came to personally thank the unit that proved me right about the M36. His gaze found Sullivan and the officer who made it happen. Palmer addressed the assembled men briefly, commending their service and acknowledging their unique contribution to the Allied victory. When he had finished, he requested a private word with Sullivan. "Walk with me, James," Palmer suggested, using Sullivan's first name for perhaps the first time. They strolled away from the assembly area toward a small rise overlooking the battalion's position. "I've just come from a planning conference in Paris," Palmer began. "The Army is already looking toward the future, analyzing the lessons of this war and planning for whatever comes next." Sullivan nodded, unsurprised. The military never stopped planning, even in the immediate aftermath of victory. "Your experience with the M36 program is of particular interest," Palmer continued. You took a concept from drawing board to battlefield in record time, developed innovative tactics, and achieved remarkable results against superior enemy technology. That process of rapid adaptation to battlefield realities is what interests them most. Sullivan understood the implications. They want to institutionalize the approach. Exactly. And they want you to help lead that effort. Palmer explained that a new Armored Doctrine Development Center was being established at Fort Knox, Kentucky. Sullivan was being offered a key position with responsibility for incorporating wartime lessons into future training and equipment development. It's a chance to ensure what you learned with the M36 isn't forgotten, Palmer concluded. A chance to shape how the Army approaches armored warfare for the next generation. Sullivan considered the offer carefully. He had planned to return to civilian engineering after the war, resuming the career interrupted by global conflict. But Palmer's proposal offered something equally compelling: the opportunity to transform his battlefield experience into lasting institutional knowledge. "I'll need to think about it, sir," Sullivan replied honestly. "Discuss it with my family." Palmer nodded understandingly. "Of course, but don't take too long. The Army is moving quickly on this, as it should. The lessons of war fade rapidly in peacetime unless deliberately preserved." As Palmer departed, Sullivan remained on the small rise, gazing across the German landscape, now peaceful in the spring sunshine. The war had transformed him in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. Could he simply return to civilian life, leaving behind the hard-won knowledge gained through combat? Or did he have a responsibility to ensure those lessons informed future generations? The decision would require careful consideration. But as Sullivan rejoined his men, watching them prepare their M36s for the journey home, he felt the pull of continued service. The M36 had been just the beginning. There would be new challenges, new threats, new technologies. The process of adaptation and innovation that had proven so crucial in this war would be equally vital in whatever conflicts lay ahead. That evening, as sunset painted the western sky in hues of orange and gold, Sullivan found himself alone with the M36 that had been his command vehicle throughout the campaign. Running his hand along its battle-scarred hull, he reflected on the journey they had shared. From controversial prototype to battle-winning weapon, the M36 had exceeded all expectations, including his own. "Saying goodbye?" came a voice from behind him. Sullivan turned to find Thomas approaching, his former gunner, now a decorated officer in his own right. "Just remembering," Sullivan replied. "Hard to believe it's been less than a year since Aberdeen." Thomas nodded, understanding perfectly. Time compresses in war. A day can feel like a week, a month like a year. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, both men lost in their memories of the campaign now concluded. Finally, Thomas spoke again. "The men have been talking. They're wondering what happens to the M36 after we return home. Will it be developed further or simply retired now that the war is over?" It was a question Sullivan had pondered himself. The M36, for all its success, had been designed as an interim solution, a stopgap until purpose-built tanks like the Pershing could reach the battlefield in numbers. Now, with peace restored, would the lessons of the M36 program be preserved or forgotten? "That depends partly on us," Sullivan replied thoughtfully. "On whether we ensure the knowledge we gained is passed on to the next generation. The vehicle itself may be superseded, but the principles we develop, the emphasis on firepower, mobility, and tactical flexibility, those should endure." Thomas considered this perspective. So even if the M36 itself is retired, its legacy continues through doctrine and training. Exactly, weapons evolve, but principles endure. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger with a priority communication from Army headquarters. Sullivan opened the sealed envelope and read its contents with growing interest. "What is it?" Thomas inquired, noting Sullivan's expression. "Orders establishing a technical evaluation team," Sullivan explained. "We're to document the M36's combat performance in detail, with specific emphasis on lessons applicable to future armored vehicle development." The implications were clear. The Army recognized the value of the M36 experience and was taking steps to preserve its lessons for future application. Sullivan felt a sense of validation, not for himself personally, but for the concept he had championed against considerable institutional resistance. As Sullivan prepared for sleep that night, in the relative comfort of a German farmhouse requisitioned as an officer's quarters, his thoughts returned to Palmer's offer. The position at Fort Knox represented an opportunity to influence the future of American armored warfare, to ensure the hard-won knowledge of combat was not lost in the transition to peace. By morning, his decision was made. He would accept the position, continuing his service in a new capacity. The journey that had begun with tragedy at Normandy would now extend into peacetime, transforming battlefield experience into institutional wisdom. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity as Sullivan's battalion prepared for return to the United States. Equipment was inventoried, records organized, and men processed for redeployment. Throughout this period, Sullivan worked with a technical evaluation team, documenting every aspect of the M36's combat performance and the tactical doctrine developed around its capabilities. Finally, on a bright June morning, Sullivan stood on the deck of a transport ship as it departed the French coast bound for America. Behind him lay the battlefields of Europe, where the M36 had proven its worth in the crucible of combat. Ahead lay new challenges and responsibilities, continuing the work begun amid the chaos of war. As the European coastline receded into the distance, Sullivan reflected on the journey completed and the one yet to begin. The M36 had been more than just a weapon system. It represented American adaptability, the capacity to recognize a problem and develop practical solutions under the most demanding circumstances. That spirit of innovation, more than any specific technology, would be his most important legacy. Chapter 12, Full Circle. Arlington, Virginia, 1973. Lieutenant Colonel James Sullivan, retired, concluded his narrative and glanced at his grandson, David, who had listened with rapt attention throughout the afternoon and into the evening. The story of the M36 and Sullivan's wartime experiences had transported them both back to a pivotal moment in history, a time when American ingenuity had overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges. So that's how the M36 went from stopgap to big cat killer, Sullivan concluded, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. Not because it was the strongest tank or the newest, but because it was the right solution at the right time. David sat in thoughtful silence for a moment, processing the remarkable story his grandfather had shared. As an engineering student, he had approached the subject with technical curiosity. But Sullivan's narrative had revealed dimensions beyond mere specifications and capabilities. It was a story of adaptation, innovation, and the human elements that ultimately determined battlefield success. What happened after the war? David finally asked. You mentioned accepting the position at Fort Knox, but did the lessons of the M36 actually influence post-war tank development? Sullivan smiled, pleased by the insightful question. More than I initially expected. The technical evaluation we conducted became foundational to several post-war armor developments. The emphasis on superior firepower and first-hit capability influenced the M26 Pershing's eventual successors, particularly the M48 Patton and later the M60. He rose from his chair and moved to a bookshelf, retrieving a leather-bound volume. This is the final report our team produced. The specific recommendations about gun caliber, fire control systems, and tactical doctrine found their way into Army planning for decades afterward. David examined the document with newfound appreciation. And the original crew? Harrington, Thomas, Martinez, and Walker, what happened to them? They returned to civilian life for the most part, Sullivan replied, a hint of nostalgia coloring his voice. Harrington went back to the racing circuit, became a respected mechanic for Indianapolis teams. Thomas returned to Montana, used his marksmanship skills as a professional hunting guide. Martinez finished his engineering degree at MIT on the GI Bill, eventually joined NASA during the Apollo program. He paused, his expression sobering slightly. Walker was the only one who stayed in the service. Made a career in the Army, served in Korea in the early days of Vietnam. We lost touch eventually, as happens in military life. David nodded, understanding the bittersweet nature of wartime bonds that often loosened in peacetime. And the M36 itself, what became of them after the war? Most were mothballed or scrapped as the Army transitioned to purpose-built tanks, Sullivan explained. Some were transferred to Allied nations through military assistance programs. They served with several European armies into the 1950s, and a few remained in service with South Korea until quite recently. He gestured toward the Model M1 Abrams that David had brought earlier. But the true legacy isn't in the specific vehicle. It's in the approach to problem-solving that it represented. The willingness to adapt, to recognize reality, and respond accordingly rather than clinging to predetermined doctrines or concepts. David studied the modern tank model with new perspective. So there's a direct line from the M36 to this, from your work to modern armor design? Not direct, no, Sullivan qualified. Military technology evolves through many influences, but some of the fundamental principles we established with the M36 have endured. The emphasis on superior firepower, engagement at maximum effective range, tactical mobility, these concepts remain relevant regardless of the specific platform. As evening deepened outside the windows of Sullivan's study, their conversation continued, bridging generations and connecting past to present. David, initially curious about engineering specifications, found himself increasingly engaged with the human dimensions of his grandfather's story. The leadership challenges, the bonds formed under fire, the responsibility of command decisions that determined life and death. There's one thing I still don't understand, David said finally. With all the production advantages the United States had, why didn't we just build better tanks from the beginning? Why was the M36 necessary at all? Sullivan nodded approvingly, recognizing the penetrating nature of the question. That's the heart of it, isn't it? The answer involves multiple factors: industrial capacity committed to existing designs, institutional resistance to change, the inherent challenges of shifting production priorities mid-war. But fundamentally, it was about recognition. Recognition, David prompted? Recognition that our initial approach was inadequate for the evolving battlefield reality, Sullivan clarified. Large organizations, military or civilian, often struggle with that kind of honest self-assessment. Acknowledging a problem exists is the necessary first step towards solving it, but it's often the most difficult step to take. He gestured toward the photograph on his desk, the 5 men standing proudly beside their M36. What made the M36 program successful wasn't just the technical solution it provided. It was the institutional willingness to recognize a problem and address it promptly, even if that meant challenging established doctrine and admitting previous approaches were insufficient. David absorbed this insight, recognizing its relevance beyond military contexts. That applies to engineering challenges too, doesn't it? Being willing to change direction when evidence shows the current approach isn't working. Exactly, Sullivan affirmed, pleased by his grandson's perception. In engineering, in military affairs, in life itself, the ability to adapt to changing circumstances often determines success or failure. The M36 story is ultimately about adaptation, about finding practical solutions to immediate problems rather than waiting for perfect answers that might come too late. As their conversation drew to a natural conclusion, David carefully packed away his model tank and the notes he had taken throughout his grandfather's narrative. "Thank you for sharing this with me," he said simply. "It's given me a whole new perspective on engineering challenges and how to approach them." Sullivan walked his grandson to the door, feeling the satisfying weight of transmitted knowledge between generations. The M36 story might never appear in mainstream history books with the prominence of great battles or famous generals, but its lessons about adaptation, innovation, and practical problem-solving would live on through connections like this, person to person, generation to generation. "Will you tell me more about your time at Fort Knox next visit?" David asked as they reached the door. "About how you transformed the M36 experience into training doctrine." Sullivan smiled, touched by his grandson's genuine interest in what many might consider dry military history. "I'd like that very much. There's much to learn from how organizations either preserve or lose critical knowledge during transitions from war to peace." After David had departed, Sullivan returned to his study. The evening had grown late, but he felt energized rather than tired, the act of sharing his experiences having renewed rather than depleted him. He picked up the photograph from his desk, studying the faces of men long since scattered by time and circumstance. They had achieved something remarkable together, these ordinary men confronting extraordinary challenges. The M36 had never been designed to be remembered as a legendary weapon. It had been created to fulfill an immediate, pressing need. Yet in doing so faithfully and effectively, it had earned a place in the complex tapestry of military history. Sullivan replaced the photograph on his desk, positioning it where the morning light would catch it as it had for nearly 30 years. The M36 story represented more than just a successful weapons program. It embodied principles that remained relevant regardless of technological evolution. The value of adaptation, the importance of practical solutions, the primacies of battlefield reality over theoretical doctrine. As he prepared for sleep, Sullivan's thoughts drifted to the countless American tank crews whose lives had been saved, by the M36's superior firepower and effective tactical employment. Men who had returned home to build families, careers, and communities, contributing to the post-war prosperity that had transformed America. Men like Frank Miller, whose sacrifice had spurred Sullivan's determination to give American tankers a fighting chance against superior German armor. In the final analysis, that was the M36's true legacy, not the technical specifications or even the tactical innovations, but the lives preserved through timely adaptation to battlefield realities. The stopgap had become a lifeline, the interim solution a battle-winning weapon. Most importantly, the lessons learned through its development and deployment had influenced military thinking long after the vehicle itself had passed into history. As sleep finally claimed him, Sullivan's last conscious thought was one of satisfaction. The story had been passed on, the knowledge preserved, the legacy secured. The journey that had begun with tragedy at Normandy had come full circle in this peaceful Virginia evening, connecting past to present and ensuring the hard-won wisdom of combat would inform future generations facing their own unique challenges. The M36 tank destroyer, once a controversial answer to a pressing battlefield problem, had ultimately become much more, a testament to American ingenuity, adaptability, and the pragmatic approach to problem-solving that had helped secure victory in humanity's greatest conflict. Not the perfect solution, but the right solution when it mattered most. And in both war and peace, that made all the difference.